What if the stories you trust most were designed to keep you asleep? Not through malice, not through conspiracy, but through something quieter: memory, retelling, simplification. History becomes myth, myth becomes memory. And you, sitting there falling slowly into rest, have carried echoes of those myths all your life. Tonight, we walk backward, through forgotten cities and quiet fires, through the cracks beneath famous names and timeless symbols. Every great empire, every ancient figure, every whispered legend hides a quieter truth. Real experiments, real minds, and real events rewritten by time itself. These are not fantasies. These are not bedtime stories. These are real paradoxes hiding inside history's most famous myths. 50 fragments, 50 myths. And as you listen, you may start to wonder, if history itself is a story that changes with every telling, then where does your story truly begin? You stand before a massive wooden structure, silent, towering, a gift, they said, a victory prize. You touch its surface, smooth, solid, warm from the midday sun, but as your fingers linger, something begins to feel wrong. It's too perfect, too deliberate, and yet everyone around you believes it's real, believes it's safe. The illusion has already taken root. History remembers the Trojan horse as the ultimate trick, an enemy hidden within a gift. But that's only the surface. The deeper truth is not about war. It's about belief, about how easily the human mind replaces suspicion with comfort when a story feels complete. Archaeologists debate whether the horse itself existed. Some say it was a siege engine misremembered. Some say it was a poetic invention. But the real experiment lies in how the story endures. Consider. In psychology, there's a phenomenon called the misinformation effect. Elizabeth Loftus demonstrated it in the 1970s. Show someone an event. Then, later, feed them a small false detail. A red car instead of a blue one. A yield sign instead of a stop sign. Their memory shifts. They'll swear it was always true. The Trojan horse operates the same way, on a cultural level. The myth writes itself over the fact. Replaces siege towers with stories. Replaces engineers with gods. Now imagine your own mind as that city of Troy. Every day, new memories, new facts arrive at your gates. You decide which ones to let in. But how often are those facts illusions? The trap is recursive. The more detailed the story, the more your brain accepts it. The bigger the horse, the safer it seems. And once the illusion lives inside, it doesn't just sit quietly. It changes everything else. One false belief hidden in plain sight can warp every choice that follows. So tonight, as you drift between wakefulness and sleep, ask yourself, if you've already accepted countless Trojan horses into your mind, how would you know? You stand at the edge of a map so vast it curves away from your vision. Colors fade into distance. Names flicker like echoes. India, Canada, Australia, South Africa. Once there was a phrase spoken with quiet certainty: the sun never sets on the British Empire. It felt infinite, unstoppable. But as you stare into the horizon, something shifts. The sky darkens. The sun dips below an invisible line. And you realize, even the grandest myths can be shadows cast by something smaller. Historically, the phrase referred to the reach of Britain's colonies, always, somewhere. It was daylight in one, a poetic expression of dominance. But as historians now admit, the phrase was partly an illusion. Many territories were nominal, others already slipping away, and some maps exaggerated borders. Empire and map, belief and reality, they mirrored each other, even when one wasn't entirely true. In cognitive psychology, there's a related phenomenon, the illusion of completeness. It happens when your brain fills in gaps automatically. You see a map, you assume it covers everything. You read a headline, you trust it speaks for the whole story. Studies show that even minimal cues, an authoritative voice, an official label, trigger this mental shortcut. Daniel Kahneman described it as System 1 thinking, fast, automatic, and often wrong. Imagine now standing inside one of those distant colonies, a solitary island, a single red flag. From the inside, the empire might feel less infinite, less eternal. But the myth persists because of perspective, because those at the center always see things as bigger than they are. It isn't just history, it's a pattern repeating everywhere. In countries, in companies, in identities. The bigger you appear on paper, the harder it is to admit where the edges really are. There's a trap hidden in the scale. The bigger something looks, the less you question its details. The more maps you see with red splashes across the globe, the less you wonder which parts were already fading. Just as with the misinformation effect, the mind prefers a neat, complete narrative to a fractured, uncertain one. So as you listen now, drifting further into stillness, consider the maps inside your own mind. Maps of memory, maps of self, maps of certainty. How many of them feel infinite simply because you haven't yet walked to their edges? And if the sun never sets, how would you know where the night begins? You are standing before a mirror that does not show your face. Instead, it shows a silhouette wrapped in gold and linen, eyes marked by kohl, a crown shaped like a coiled snake. Cleopatra, Queen of Egypt, the symbol of seduction, intellect and betrayal. But as you watch, the image ripples like heat rising from desert stone, and you notice the edges blur, the features change. What if her face was never like this? What if the Cleopatra you see was always a myth? For centuries, Cleopatra has been described as history's most beautiful woman. Painters imagined her with flawless skin, perfect symmetry, hypnotic gaze. But there's a crack in that image. Ancient coins from her time show a different face. Strong, angular, slightly hooked nose, not the softened ideal. Plutarch himself, writing decades after her death, said her beauty was not in her face, but in her voice, her presence. Her power wasn't in how she looked, it was in how she made others feel. Psychologists would recognize this as the halo effect. First identified by Edward Thorndike in 1920, the halo effect shows how one positive trait, like beauty, can distort how we judge all others. If someone is attractive, we assume they are smarter, kinder, more capable. In experiments, participants rated essays as better written when they believed the author was physically attractive. The mind ties image to value, even when the connection isn't real. Cleopatra's myth grew in this exact loop. Writers and artists projected beauty onto her because they couldn't explain her influence otherwise. How could a woman, especially in ancient times, command the loyalty of two Roman generals, hold empires in balance? The answer had to be beauty, they assumed, and so history rewrote itself in the image of that assumption. Now step back from the mirror. Imagine every myth you carry about yourself, the ones you were told as a child, the ones society whispers through screens and stories. Are they based on fact or on the halo effect, applied to your own reflection? This is where the paradox deepens. The more often a myth is repeated, the more real it feels. Cognitive scientist Ulrich Neisser called this reconstructive memory, the way our brain rewrites past events based on repeated exposure to stories. Say Cleopatra is beautiful enough times, and she becomes that beauty in the collective mind. Show someone an image often enough, and they will start to believe it's a photograph instead of an invention. And so you must ask yourself, what other faces in history, in life, in your own mirror, are masks worn too long? If Cleopatra's real power was never her beauty, then what power might you already possess, hidden beneath your own illusion? You stand in a darkened museum hall, lit only by silent glass cases. Inside one case, a bronze helmet, weathered and scarred by time. Your mind fills in the missing pieces automatically. Long horns curving from either side, fierce shadows cast upon the wall behind it. A Viking warrior, a raider from the frozen north. But as you step closer, the horns vanish. The helmet is plain. No spikes, no ornament, just iron and silence. The image you carried was never real. The horned Viking helmet is one of history's most persistent illusions. There is no archaeological evidence, no burial, no artifact that shows Vikings wore such helmets into battle. The myth began much later. In the 19th century, artists and costume designers dressing Wagnerian opera characters gave Vikings horns to make them look wilder, more fearsome. That image seeped into posters, books, films, until it replaced reality. Psychologists call this phenomenon source misattribution. In a study by Marcia Johnson and colleagues, participants were shown a mix of images and descriptions. Later, many recalled invented details as if they were part of the original image. Their minds could not distinguish between what they had seen and what they had imagined. The Viking horns operate on the same principle, a cultural memory created by misattributed sources. The reason it works so well ties back to human need for visual shorthand. Our brains crave symbols. Horns equal danger. Sharp curves equal aggression. It's simpler to believe in a fierce enemy who looks the part than to accept a more mundane truth that real warriors might look just like ordinary men. Now picture yourself wearing that helmet. No horns, just cold metal pressed against your forehead. The true weight of battle was not in appearance, but in intention. Yet the illusion holds because it serves a deeper psychological function, defining us versus them. By making the other seem monstrous, history makes conquest and conflict easier to justify. The paradox repeats everywhere. A detail added after the fact becomes inseparable from the core story. And the more times it's told through movies, books, museums, the harder it becomes to peel away the layer and see what was truly there. There is a trap here, recursive and quiet. You carry not just Viking helmets, but thousands of false symbols in your own mind, about history, about yourself, about others. So tonight, as sleep folds around you like iron and snow, ask yourself, if even the fiercest warrior you imagine was never wearing horns, then how many of your fears are wearing costumes you never noticed? You stand in a grand hall lined with mirrors, stretching endlessly in both directions. At first you notice the reflection of a man, one hand tucked into his coat, hat tilted, eyes sharp with quiet calculation, Napoleon Bonaparte. But something feels off. The mirrors seem to shrink him. His height seems smaller than it should be. You step closer, only to realize the man's true size has nothing to do with his shadow. For more than 2 centuries, history has repeated the same story. Napoleon was short, barely over 5 feet tall, they said. But this wasn't entirely true. Records show Napoleon stood around 5 feet 6 or 5 feet 7 inches in French measurements of his time, average for a man in early 19th century Europe. The myth of his height likely came from 2 sources, a confusion between French and British measurement systems, and deliberate political caricatures by British artists who exaggerated his stature to mock him. This myth ties into a cognitive trap psychologists call the anchoring effect. First identified by Amos Tversky and Daniel Kahneman, it shows how an initial piece of information, no matter how random, sets a baseline for all future judgments. If you hear once that Napoleon was small, every image you see thereafter adjusts to fit that baseline. Even knowing the truth later doesn't fully erase the anchor. Imagine walking through a hall of mirrors, distorted by anchoring. At each turn, the reflection changes not because reality changes, but because your mind reinterprets what it sees based on a single early belief. Napoleon's height becomes a metaphor, how one small piece of misinformation can shape the way entire generations perceive strength, leadership, or power. But why did the myth survive so long? Because it serves a purpose. Making Napoleon small fits a comfortable narrative. That great ambition comes from compensating for physical shortcomings. It makes the story easier to digest, more human, more ironic. Psychologists call this narrative bias, the tendency to favor stories that follow familiar emotional arcs, even if those arcs distort factual truth. Now imagine applying that lens inward. How many of your own beliefs about your abilities, your limitations, your history, are anchored in some long-ago misinterpreted detail? How many of those mirrors you walk past each day reflect not your true size, but the size history assigned to you? This is the quiet trap. Once an anchor is placed, it drags everything else with it. Even now, as you listen, your mind may still picture Napoleon as smaller than he was. That's how deep the loop runs. So as your thoughts soften into quiet, drifting like echoes across mirrored halls, ask yourself, if one misstep in measurement can shrink an empire, how much of your own story has been quietly resized? You walk through a village made of wood and whispers. The buildings lean with age. The air smells of smoke and damp earth. In the town square, there's a wooden post. No one speaks loudly. Eyes watch from behind shuttered windows. A name is called. Someone steps forward, not because they are guilty, but because fear has already decided. You are in Salem, and the real story is not about witches. It's about the mind's hunger for certainty, even when no evidence exists. The Salem witch trials of 1692 have become a symbol of mass hysteria. Dozens accused, many imprisoned, some executed. The common myth is that everyone truly believed witches were real, that it was a simple matter of superstition. But history shows something quieter and more complex. Property disputes, personal grudges, even accidental food poisoning from ergot-infected rye. Many factors fed into the panic. It wasn't just belief, it was social contagion. Psychologists today call this phenomenon collective delusion. A real-world experiment echoes it. In the 1960s, Leon Festinger's cognitive dissonance studies showed how groups under stress will double down on irrational beliefs to maintain social harmony. If one person questions the shared fear, they risk isolation, and so fear becomes fact, simply because everyone agrees not to look too closely. Picture now that wooden post again. Tied there is not a witch but a mirror. And in the mirror you see yourself, not because you committed some crime but because your mind, like everyone else's, seeks patterns in chaos. It's called apophenia, the tendency to see connections where none exist. Smoke in the sky becomes a dragon. A shadow in the woods becomes a monster. A headache becomes a curse. The trap is recursive. The more people agree on a pattern, the more real it becomes in the mind. During the trials, spectral evidence, testimony about invisible forces was accepted in court. Dreams and visions were treated as fact. Today we like to think we've moved past that. But social media, urban legends, conspiracy theories, they all follow the same neural pathway. You believe because others believe. You doubt because others doubt. Certainty becomes its own kind of contagion. And here lies the quiet paradox. The more frightened we are, the more we cling to simple answers: witches, demons, villains. But what if the real danger was never outside? What if the true haunting lives in the human mind's endless need to explain the unexplainable? So as you drift further now into stillness, wrapped in a darker kind of quiet, ask yourself, if you were living through your own witch panic, would you know when to step away from the crowd? You stand beneath towering stone arches, in a palace too large to see all at once. Velvet curtains stir in the breeze. Gilded mirrors reflect candles that never seem to burn down. And in the center of it all, a single voice echoes. Soft, dismissive, unforgettable. Let them eat cake. You hear it as if she is whispering it directly to you. But as you listen closer, the voice begins to blur. The words change shape, because Marie Antoinette never spoke them. The phrase "let them eat cake" is one of history's most enduring myths, a line supposedly uttered by the Queen of France when told that her people had no bread, but historians agree, there is no record of her saying it. The phrase appears decades earlier, written by Jean-Jacques Rousseau in his autobiographical work Confessions, and it referred not to Marie Antoinette, but to an unnamed great princess. Over time, the story fused with her image, wealth, extravagance, detachment, and solidified into fact. Why does such a myth persist? Psychologists would recognize this as a form of confirmation bias. Once a belief is in place, Marie Antoinette is a symbol of excess. Any detail that supports that belief feels true, whether it is or not. Charles Lord, Lee Ross, and Mark Lepper demonstrated this in 1979, showing how people interpret ambiguous evidence in ways that reinforce their existing opinions. Imagine now standing in that grand hall again. Every mirror, every painting, every echo reinforces the image of a queen untouched by suffering. But what if the mirrors are only showing what you already expect to see? That's the trap. The more certain a story feels, the less we question its source. There's another layer to this: false memory formation. Psychologist Elizabeth Loftus proved that people could be made to remember events that never happened through carefully structured suggestion. In one experiment, participants were told as children that they had once been lost in a mall. Many later recalled vivid details of the event, details that were entirely invented. Let them eat cake operates the same way on a societal scale, a collective false memory shaped by repetition and cultural reinforcement. But here's the recursive twist. Even knowing this now, even hearing that Marie Antoinette likely never said those words, part of you still holds on to the image, the grand hall, the cake, the queen's dismissive face. That's the quiet power of myth. It survives logic. It loops beneath facts, carrying weight long after its origins are forgotten. So as you drift deeper into rest, walking through the halls of stories you thought were true, ask yourself, if a single sentence can echo through centuries without ever being spoken, how many of your own truths are only echoes waiting to fade? You find yourself floating above a vast, silent planet. No sound, no wind, just an endless horizon curving into darkness. Below you, rivers twist like silver threads. Mountains rise in slow, silent folds. And then in the distance you see it, a long, winding line cutting through the landscape, the Great Wall of China, the one human structure visible from space. Or so you've always been told. But as you drift closer, that line dissolves into ridges and shadows. The wall isn't there at all. The belief that the Great Wall of China is visible from space is one of the most widespread modern myths. It appears in textbooks, trivia games, even astronaut interviews. Yet astronauts themselves, including those on the Apollo missions and aboard the International Space Station, have confirmed the wall is nearly impossible to see with the naked eye. It blends into the natural landscape. Its materials, mostly stone and earth, match the colors of the surrounding terrain. What keeps this myth alive is a form of cognitive distortion called availability heuristic. First identified by psychologists Amos Tversky and Daniel Kahneman, this effect shows how easily remembered examples shape our sense of truth. The wall is massive, it's famous, so the mind assumes it must stand out. But reality is quieter, less grand. The wall, for all its scale, disappears from view when you step far enough away. Now imagine that concept applied inward. Your own mind is filled with great walls, beliefs, memories, assumptions that feel vast simply because you've lived alongside them so long. But if you could float high enough above your own thoughts, would they still stand out? Or would they fade into the background, just another line in the landscape? The paradox is recursive. The more you believe in something's scale, the less you question its actual presence. Like the outline illusion in visual perception studies, people perceive edges that aren't there simply because they expect to see them. Experiments show how the brain completes patterns automatically, filling in blanks with imagined lines. That's what the Great Wall myth represents, a completed pattern in the mind, a line that isn't truly visible, yet feels undeniable. So as your thoughts drift into a quieter orbit tonight, ask yourself, If even the greatest walls can vanish when viewed from the right distance, how many of your own boundaries exist only because you've never stepped far enough back? You are standing at the edge of an endless ocean. The sky folds gently into the horizon, a perfect curve of blue upon blue. No sharp corners, no edges. And yet somewhere beneath your feet, in stories that never quite died, there is a quieter thought whispering, what if it isn't round? What if everything you see is a lie? What if the earth is flat? Most believe the flat earth myth belongs to ancient times, but history tells a stranger story. Medieval scholars in Europe, including Thomas Aquinas and even sailors like Columbus, accepted the earth as spherical. The myth that people once believed in a flat earth was largely popularized in the 19th century, ironically as part of efforts to paint earlier ages as ignorant. And yet in the 21st century the belief resurged. Groups and forums and videos, watched by millions, argued once again for a flat plane beneath the sky. Why? Psychologists trace this to a pattern called belief perseverance. Even in the face of overwhelming contradictory evidence, the human mind can cling to an idea if it satisfies deeper needs: control, identity, defiance. There's an experiment that mirrors this exact loop, the backfire effect, studied by Brendan Nyhan and Jason Reifler. They showed how people presented with evidence disproving their belief would often dig in deeper, becoming more convinced rather than less. Correction becomes fuel for the illusion. Imagine now that you are not standing on Earth at all, but floating just above it. Watching, you see the curve clearly, but inside your mind a small voice still wonders, what if I'm wrong? That's where the paradox deepens. Because even knowing the truth, part of the mind enjoys the trap, the forbidden question, the secret belief. It creates a loop of thought, real, unreal, real again. There's something comforting about simple shapes, flat planes, straight lines. Circles and spheres are harder to trust, more ambiguous, less fixed, and so the flat earth myth lives not because it's logical, but because it feels easier. The deeper trap is not in what's true or false, but in what feels safe to believe. So tonight, as you drift further, ask yourself, if even the shape beneath your feet can be reimagined by the mind, how many of your certainties are just shapes drawn in sand, waiting for the tide to erase them? You stand before a door that no longer exists. Stone walls rise around you, cracked, dusted with ash. The air holds the weight of pages burned long ago. Behind this door, they say, was the greatest collection of knowledge the ancient world had ever seen. Scrolls, maps, treatises, gone, lost in fire. The Library of Alexandria. But as you reach for the handle, it crumbles into dust, and a quieter question takes its place. What if the real library was never what you imagined? The myth of the Library of Alexandria is one of history's most persistent echoes, a place where all the knowledge of the ancient world was gathered, then destroyed in a single cataclysm. But historians reveal a more layered truth. The library wasn't just one building, it existed as part of a larger institution called the Mausoleum, scattered across parts of the city. Its loss wasn't caused by a single fire, but by centuries of neglect, political shifts, and smaller destructions. Yet the myth survives. Why? Psychologists call this the single event fallacy, the human tendency to prefer simple causes over complex chains. In the 1940s, Fritz Heider studied how people attribute events to clear, direct causes, even when those events are the result of tangled, gradual processes. One big fire is easier to understand than centuries of quiet erosion. Imagine now standing inside that ancient room, not as it burned but as it slowly emptied. One scroll taken here, one shelf neglected there. No dramatic flame, just quiet fading. That's the deeper paradox. Loss rarely happens all at once. It happens in increments so small you don't notice until the room is empty. And this applies far beyond history. Memory operates the same way. There's a phenomenon called memory decay. Over time, neural pathways weaken, but it's not a clean break. It's a slow fade, a name on the tip of your tongue, a fact half remembered, a face you know but can't place, like scrolls slipping one by one from their shelves. Now imagine your own mind as its own library. How many truths do you carry that are already fading? How many beliefs feel solid, while quietly hollowing out beneath their surface? There's another layer, reconstructive memory, a concept from cognitive psychology. When people recall something they once knew, they often fill in gaps with details that never existed. A title of a book, a face in the crowd. We don't just lose knowledge, we rewrite it, piece by piece, into something simpler, like reducing the long history of Alexandria's library into a single night of fire. And here is the quiet trap. The more often the story is told, the more real it feels. Not because it's true, but because it's complete. Think now about how many of your own losses you remember as sudden moments. Relationships, beliefs, opportunities. But if you look closer, Were they really sudden, or did they fade gradually, one scroll at a time? The Library of Alexandria becomes a mirror, a myth not just about history but about how we experience forgetting, about the weight we place on what's gone, even as we overlook what's still in our hands. So tonight, as you drift further into sleep, walking corridors that no longer hold shelves, ask yourself, if the greatest library in history didn't vanish in fire but in silence, what quiet rooms in your own mind are already turning to dust while you look elsewhere? You stand on a shoreline made of stone and mist. Waves roll in quietly, smooth as glass, touching ruins that shouldn't be there, pillars half buried in sand, marble steps leading nowhere. Somewhere beneath the waves, an entire city waits. Atlantis. You've heard its name your whole life, a civilization so advanced, so powerful, it vanished beneath the sea in a single night. But as you watch the tide pull back, a quieter thought rises. What if Atlantis was never lost, because it was never real? The myth of Atlantis comes from a single source, Plato. Around 360 BCE, in his dialogues Timaeus and Critias, he described a mighty city destroyed by the gods for its hubris. But Plato was a philosopher, not a historian. Most scholars now agree, Atlantis was likely a thought experiment, an allegory, a warning wrapped in a story. Yet somehow, across 2,000 years, the tale hardened into something else, a historical rumor, a place people searched for as if it were fact. This ties into a psychological pattern known as myth persistence. Once a story feels emotionally significant, the mind resists letting it go. Studies by Dan McAdams show that humans instinctively weave personal and cultural events into larger narrative arcs. Atlantis fits perfectly. A rise, a fall, a moral lesson hidden beneath marble and coral. Now imagine standing not above water but beneath it, walking silent streets carved from your own memories, cities you've imagined, moments you've believed in so long they feel as real as any stone. This is where the paradox deepens. Sometimes myths feel more solid than facts because they are built from something deeper, desire. Atlantis isn't just a city, it's a symbol of everything we fear losing: knowledge, greatness, a golden age slipping beneath the waves. Psychologists call this symbolic immortality. When confronted with mortality or decay, the human mind clings to stories that promise something enduring beyond ourselves. Atlantis becomes not history but hope, wearing the mask of history. And there's another layer, cryptomnesia. Coined by Theodore Flournoy, this is when the mind recalls a forgotten memory as an original thought. Cultures experience this too. Myths recycled as facts, old stories retold as fresh discovery. Someone finds ruins in the Mediterranean or the Caribbean, and suddenly Atlantis breathes again, not because it's there, but because we've always carried it. Imagine now your own personal Atlantises, the beliefs, the memories, the truths you tell yourself that feel ancient, solid, untouchable. But are they? Or are they stories you once needed and now no longer see as separate from reality? The quiet trap here isn't about cities lost to the sea. It's about minds lost to their own stories. Once a narrative sinks deep enough, it no longer feels like myth, it feels like self. So as you drift deeper tonight, floating on quiet tides between sleep and waking, ask yourself, if Atlantis was never truly lost, but invented to carry something heavier than stone, how many of your own myths are waiting quietly beneath the surface, shaping you even now? You walk through a cathedral carved from shadow and stone. Candles flicker along endless walls. Beneath your feet, cold marble echoes with footsteps long forgotten. Somewhere, hidden beyond these corridors, they say there is treasure, gold, relics, secret scrolls, the lost wealth of the Knights Templar. But as you search the dark corners, something stirs, a quieter truth. What if the real treasure was never gold, but belief itself? The story of the Knights Templar is tangled in history and myth. Founded in the early 12th century as warrior monks protecting pilgrims in the Holy Land, they rose to immense wealth and power. But in 1307, under King Philip IV of France, the order was dismantled. Accused of heresy, many Templars were arrested, tortured, executed, and so the legend grew that somewhere they hid their vast treasure before it could be seized. Hidden vaults beneath churches, ships vanishing into mist, chests buried beneath distant sands. Yet historians find no solid evidence of such treasure. The Templars' wealth, while real, was mostly in land and debts owed to them, assets easily seized by the crown. But the idea of a hidden vault survived. Why? Psychologists would recognize this as a form of pattern completion. When faced with an incomplete story, the human brain fills in the blanks automatically. Studies show that even with fragments, half-heard songs, unfinished sentences, the mind invents completions that feel true. The Templar legend is one vast unfinished sentence: powerful warriors, sudden downfall, What else could there be but a secret hidden away? Now imagine yourself holding a key that opens no door. You carry it because it feels like it must unlock something. That's the deeper trap. The real treasure of the Templars wasn't gold or relics, it was the myth itself, a self-perpetuating loop. Belief in the treasure creates more searches, which create more stories, which reinforce the belief. There's a related psychological principle, self-confirming prophecy. When you expect something to be true, you behave in ways that make it seem true. Treasure hunters find a hollow chamber beneath a church floor, not the treasure itself, but the echo of expectation. Think now about your own locked doors, the things you've spent years searching for, answers, meanings, truths. How many of those searches are driven not by facts, but by a quiet belief that there must be more? The paradox deepens. Even knowing the likelihood that the treasure never existed, part of you still wants it to be real. That's the loop. The idea is more valuable than the object. And that's where the Knights Templar legend mirrors something deeper in all of us. Myth becomes currency. Belief becomes treasure. So as you drift now into quieter spaces, walking corridors without end, ask yourself, if the real treasure was always belief itself, how many of your own keys are turning silently in locks that never needed to open? You stand in the middle of a burning city. The sky is painted with smoke and flame, ash swirling like snow. Shadows of crumbling arches stretch across the cobblestones. Somewhere above it all you hear music, a slow, deliberate melody rising through the fire. A man stands on a balcony, draped in silk robes, playing a fiddle as the city dies beneath him. Emperor Nero. But as the image sharpens, a quieter realization spreads through the smoke. The music isn't real. It never was. The legend is as old as the fire itself. In 64 CE, a great blaze swept through Rome. For 6 days, flames consumed districts, markets, homes, and in the middle of it the story goes, Nero watched and played the fiddle, unmoved by the suffering below. But historians, both ancient and modern, point to something else entirely. The fiddle did not yet exist in Nero's time. Its invention would come centuries later. Even more, records suggest that Nero wasn't in Rome when the fire began. He returned quickly and organized relief efforts, opening his own palaces to shelter the homeless. Yet the myth persists. Why? Because of a loop deeply rooted in human psychology, the moral contagion effect. When someone is seen as corrupt or immoral in one aspect, every other story attached to them feels more plausible, even if it's false. Studies by Kurt Gray and colleagues show how people are more likely to believe in extreme behavior from those they already dislike. Nero's reputation for cruelty, his political purges, his taste for extravagant spectacles primed the world to believe he could fiddle while Rome burned. Imagine now standing in that city not as a citizen but as an observer centuries later, watching through layers of story, of retelling, of collective judgment. The fire becomes less about the event and more about assigning blame. This ties into another psychological pattern, attribution error. We prefer neat explanations, villains who fit their crimes perfectly. It's simpler than facing the randomness of disaster. Nero's fiddle is a symbol, a metaphor hardened into memory. Even in modern experiments such as those studying false memory formation, researchers find how easily people recall details that match a story's emotional core, even if they were never part of the original event. A burning city needs music. Silence feels too empty, too real. Now reflect on your own fires. The moments in your life that seem too large, too chaotic to explain. How often have you reached for a convenient villain, a name, a reason, even if it didn't quite fit? It's called narrative causality. The tendency to shape events into a story structure even when life is not a story. There's another layer. Nero's image, solidified through paintings, operas, books, became recursive. Each retelling reinforced the last. Tacitus, Suetonius, Cassius Dio all contributed to the myth, blending facts with political bias and personal agenda. The more times it was told, the more real it became. This is memory consolidation, where repeated exposure strengthens neural pathways, turning suggestion into belief. Imagine now standing on that balcony yourself, looking down at a city you cannot save, hearing music that isn't there. How much of what you believe about yourself, your past, your failures, your guilt, is shaped by similar loops? Stories repeated so often they feel unchangeable. The quiet trap here is not just believing false history, it's allowing simplified history to shape your identity. Nero's fiddle isn't about him, it's about the human need for patterns, for blame, for meaning in flames. The paradox expands. If even the most famous details in history can emerge from nothing but suggestion, how much of what you carry as certain truth is made of the same echoes? So tonight, as you drift through quieter corridors of thought, walking from balcony to balcony in your own mind, ask yourself, If the music you hear in moments of crisis was never really there, then how many of your loudest regrets are made from silence waiting to be heard? You stand on the deck of a ship so vast it feels like a city floating on black water. The night sky stretches above you, cloudless, cold. Around you, polished wood gleams under electric lamps. Chandeliers swing quietly with the ocean's rhythm. Somewhere deep inside the ship you hear a quiet voice. It is unsinkable. And yet as the cold seeps into your skin, a quieter thought echoes. What if the belief in safety was the real reason it sank? The RMS Titanic is remembered not just for its size or its passengers, but for a single phrase, the ship that even God couldn't sink. It's repeated in books, films, whispers passed down through history, but historians now reveal something more subtle. The phrase, as popularly repeated, was never officially used by the shipbuilders at Harland and Wolff, nor was it widely circulated before the sinking. It seems to have solidified in public memory after the fact, a retroactive myth born from tragedy. This ties directly into a psychological phenomenon known as hindsight bias. Studied by Baruch Fischhoff in the 1970s, hindsight bias describes how, after an event occurs, people perceive it as having been more predictable than it actually was. The Titanic's sinking wasn't just a disaster, it became, in memory, a kind of inevitable downfall. The Unsinkable label grew in parallel to the size of the loss, as if making sense of it through irony. Imagine now walking those same decks before the iceberg. The ship feels steady, solid, a floating palace of marble staircases and velvet chairs. And yet, invisibly, the seeds of its failure already exist. The missing lifeboats, the unheeded iceberg warnings, the steel plates too brittle in cold water. But these details don't fit the myth until after the story has ended. Before the crash, no one is looking for signs. That's the deeper paradox. The belief in safety creates its own form of blindness. Psychologists call this normalcy bias. In studies of disaster response, researchers found that people underestimate the probability of catastrophe because facing it feels overwhelming. Passengers on the Titanic delayed boarding lifeboats for this exact reason. Many refused to believe the ship was truly in danger until it was too late. Now imagine applying that lens inward. Your own life is filled with ships you believe are unsinkable. Plans, relationships, beliefs that feel so large and solid you never question them. But beneath the surface, quiet cracks already form. There's another layer, cultural myth-making. Just as the Trojan Horse or Atlantis grew into symbols beyond their original stories, Titanic became a canvas for modern anxieties, industrial overconfidence, class division, the limits of human technology. Films, books, documentaries, all layering new meanings onto the same event, until it feels as though the ship itself carried those ideas from the start. And this is where the trap deepens. The more you hear a story repeated, the more complete it feels. This is the illusory truth effect. A study by Lynn Hasher and colleagues showed that repeated statements, even if false, become more likely to be judged as true. Unsinkable becomes part of Titanic's DNA, not because it was real, but because we need it to be real in order to understand the scale of loss. Now picture yourself not on the deck of the Titanic, but standing in front of your own unsinkable beliefs, the promises you've made yourself that feel too large to fail. How many of them are already taking on water? How many quiet warnings have you ignored because they don't fit the myth you carry? The recursive loop here is unsettling. Belief creates blindness. Blindness creates disaster. Disaster creates belief. And the story repeats across centuries, across minds. Even knowing now that the phrase may have been a myth, part of you still feels it, still pictures those grand staircases, those lifeboats swinging quietly into the freezing Atlantic. That's the weight of cultural memory, truth softened into poetry, danger softened into story. So as you drift deeper tonight, sailing on darker waters beneath the surface of your own mind, ask yourself, if the unsinkable ship was always a story waiting to be written, how many of your own certainties are sailing quietly toward icebergs you've chosen not to see? You stand before a stone fortress perched on a cliff edge. Black towers rise against a sky stained crimson, the air cold enough to make your breath visible. Somewhere inside that fortress, a man waits. You know his name already. Dracula. Fangs, blood, eternal night. But as you step through the iron gates, the torches flicker, and the story begins to shift. There are no vampires here, only politics, war, and a truth more unsettling than fiction. The myth of Dracula, the blood-drinking immortal, traces back to Bram Stoker's 1897 novel. But the figure behind the legend is real. Vlad III, known as Vlad Tepes, or Vlad the Impaler, Prince of Wallachia in the 15th century. His reputation for cruelty, impaling enemies on wooden stakes, leaving forests of corpses as warnings, earned him fear and fame across Europe. Yet much of what survives about Vlad is tangled in propaganda and rumor. His enemies, especially the Saxons, published exaggerated tales to paint him as a monster. This merging of truth and fiction ties directly into a psychological phenomenon called source confusion. Studies by Marcia Johnson and Carol Ray show how memories can mix real events with imagined details. When people recall something they've read, watched, or dreamed, their minds sometimes blur the line between fact and fiction, especially when the fiction is emotionally charged. Dracula's blood drinking became easier to believe because of Vlad's real brutality. Imagine now walking those fortress halls, cold stone beneath your feet. Each step echoes with two stories layered on top of one another: the historical prince and the fictional vampire. The paradox deepens because both seem equally real. Psychologists call this narrative transportation, when immersion in a story makes it feel subjectively true, even in the face of contrary evidence. There's a deeper loop at work: moral amplification. The human mind exaggerates extremes. Studies in social psychology show that when recounting cruelty or heroism, people tend to amplify the details to emphasize the moral stakes. Vlad's real cruelty, perhaps strategic, perhaps defensive, became in legend something supernatural. Vampirism is simply a narrative extension of human fear. But here's the quieter trap. By turning real figures into myths, we often erase their real complexity. Vlad was not just a killer. He was also a ruler balancing power between the Ottoman Empire and Hungary, caught in the endless wars of medieval Eastern Europe. His strategies, brutal as they were, had context and purpose. Simplifying him into Dracula strips away everything else. Think now about the stories you tell yourself about others, about your past, about your own darker moments. How often do you reduce complexity into something simpler? A villain, a monster, a hero. This is called the black and white thinking trap. In psychology, it's known as splitting. Seeing things as all good or all bad, with no room in between. Imagine again that fortress. But now, instead of stone and blood, it is built from your own divided memories, parts of yourself labeled too harshly, too simply. The vampire becomes a metaphor not for someone else, but for the parts of you you've locked away in shadow. The loop continues. The more often Dracula is told, the more he exists. The same applies to your own fears, your own past mistakes. Stories repeated inside your mind harden into walls, towers, dungeons. Even knowing Vlad's real history now, part of you still sees the fangs, the cape, the pale skin. That's how strong narrative loops can become. Just as memory researchers have shown how false memories can be implanted with a few simple suggestions, cultural memory follows the same path, fiction becoming indistinguishable from fact. There's another layer: social proof. The more people believe in a story, the more believable it feels. Early vampire films, tourist posters of Bran Castle, Halloween costumes, all reinforcing the idea of Dracula, layer by layer. Studies show how group consensus can override personal doubt, creating a collective version of truth. Now reflect inward again. How many of your strongest beliefs about yourself or the world were shaped not by evidence but by repetition? By the quiet merging of voices around you until your own became part of the chorus? The real Dracula teaches something quieter than fear of monsters. It teaches the weight of simplification, the gravity of repeated narrative. It teaches that truth, once wrapped in enough layers of story, can vanish as easily as mist. So tonight, as you drift deeper into your own fortress of thought, torches flickering in endless halls, ask yourself, if even the darkest legends began as real men walking real roads, how many of your own shadows are simply truths stretched too far by the stories you keep telling yourself? You stand in a chamber that glows as if lit from within, walls of amber, gold, and mirror-paneled light stretching in all directions. Every surface shimmers like frozen fire. But as you take a step closer, the light fractures. One wall cracks, then another. The entire room dissolves into dust, floating away like smoke. You've just stepped inside the amber room, or rather the memory of it, because today it's gone. The amber room was once called the eighth wonder of the world. Crafted in the early 18th century in Prussia, gifted to Russia's Peter the Great, it was installed in the Catherine Palace near St. Petersburg, an entire room paneled with amber mosaics, gold leaf and mirrors. But during World War II, German forces looted the room. Its panels were crated and sent to Königsberg, and then silence. The amber room vanished. No definitive trace has been found since 1945. The myth surrounding its disappearance isn't just about lost treasure, it's about a larger psychological pattern called the Zeigarnik effect. Named after psychologist Bluma Zeigarnik, this effect describes how people remember unfinished tasks or incomplete experiences more vividly than completed ones. The amber room, as an unresolved story, loops endlessly in the mind's quiet corners. Imagine now walking through a museum with empty frames. Where art once hung, there's only blank space. You find yourself staring longer at those gaps than at the painting still present. That's the Zygarnik effect in motion. Completion fades, absence lingers. In the decades since the war, countless theories have emerged. The Amber Room hidden in underground bunkers, lost at sea, destroyed in Allied bombings, tucked away in private collections. Treasure hunters have searched forests, lakes, abandoned castles. Each search reinforces the room's presence in cultural memory, not because it's found, but because it isn't. This ties into another psychological principle, object permanence in memory. Originally studied in infants by Jean Piaget, it describes how we learn that things continue to exist even when we can't see them. But with the Amber Room, this sense of permanence blends with imagination. The more vividly people describe its colors, its smell, its weight, the more solid it feels even in its absence. And there's a darker layer, loss amplification. Psychologists studying grief note that ambiguous loss, where something or someone disappears without closure, creates a stronger, longer-lasting emotional loop than definite endings. The Amber Room wasn't just stolen, it became a ghost, a symbol of cultural theft, imperial grandeur, and wartime chaos all at once. Now imagine standing in your own version of the Amber Room, not a place, but a part of your mind. The knowledge, memories, and beliefs you've lost quietly over time. Words you once knew, faces that have faded, stories unfinished. They don't disappear cleanly, they echo in gaps, in quiet rooms inside yourself where something once hung. The trap deepens. The search for the Amber Room becomes recursive. Each new expedition, each new clue creates fresh belief that it must still exist, even if logically it may not. This mirrors a phenomenon called motivated reasoning. Studies show that people are more likely to accept information that supports their desires and to reject facts that challenge them. The Amber Room must exist because we want it to. And this applies inward too. You carry beliefs about yourself that may no longer be true, strengths you think you've lost, flaws you believe are permanent. But like the missing amber panels, those things may already be gone, yet still haunt you through habit and repetition. Imagine again the golden walls, the panels shimmering just beyond reach. Now imagine they are not walls at all, but mirrors reflecting unfinished versions of yourself. The paradox here is subtle. The more you chase a vanished treasure, the more solid it feels, and the more real it becomes, not as an object, but as a loop, a mental structure made from absence. Even now, knowing all this, part of you still sees that room, still feels the warmth of amber glowing from polished stone. That's the strength of unresolved myth. It embeds itself into the architecture of thought. So tonight, as you drift into quieter rooms inside yourself, walking halls that flicker between memory and imagination, ask yourself, if the Amber Room's true weight lies not in gold, but in what was left unfinished, how many of your own missing pieces still shape you, even in their quietest absence? You stand before a stone doorway sealed for over 3,000 years. Carvings flicker in torchlight. Jackals, eyes, hieroglyphs, unreadable to you. The air is dry, impossibly still. And as the last stone is pried away, a breath of ancient dust escapes. Somewhere in that dust, so the legend says, there is something waiting. A curse, the curse of King Tutankhamun. But as you step inside, the quiet hum of paradox grows louder, because the curse may be less about magic and more about memory. In 1922, British archaeologist Howard Carter opened the tomb of Pharaoh Tutankhamun in Egypt's Valley of the Kings. Within months, stories spread. Members of the expedition were dying under mysterious circumstances. Lord Carnarvon, the expedition's sponsor, died from an infected mosquito bite shortly after entering the tomb. Newspapers across the world fueled the legend. An ancient curse awakened after millennia of silence. But historians and scientists now trace a quieter truth beneath the story. Many members of Carter's team lived long, healthy lives. Statistically, the mortality rate among those involved wasn't unusually high for the time. The curse was likely a combination of coincidence and sensationalism. Yet the myth persists. And here's where psychology enters. It's called the clustering illusion. In 1984, Thomas Gilovich described how the human mind tends to see patterns in random data. Presented with scattered points, people instinctively form shapes, connections. The deaths surrounding Tutankhamun's tomb, unrelated, accidental, were clustered by the mind into a single arc, the curse. Imagine standing now in the darkened tomb yourself. The walls are covered in gold and stories, but the real story is unfolding inside your mind, not on the stone. Every creak in the chamber feels louder, every shadow feels heavier. This ties into another psychological effect, expectation bias. When you expect danger, your brain filters reality to confirm it. Studies in behavioral psychology show how fear primes the senses. Heart rate increases, sounds are amplified, Memory becomes selective. That's what the curse does. It becomes a self-fulfilling loop. The more you believe, the more real it feels. And belief, in this context, is its own kind of trap. There's a quieter layer still. The tomb wasn't just a site of discovery, it was a site of cultural tension. Western explorers in a colonized land, extracting treasures. The curse narrative, consciously or not, served as a psychological balancing act, a form of guilt transformed into myth. Psychologists studying collective guilt describe similar patterns. Societies weave legends around uncomfortable truths to soften them. Now reflect inward. How many of your own curses are self-made? Beliefs about bad luck, about failure, about inevitability. This is called learned helplessness, identified by Martin Seligman in the 1960s. When exposed to uncontrollable negative events, people and animals begin to expect failure, even when new opportunities for control appear. Imagine again that sealed doorway, but this time, it's not in a tomb, it's in your own mind. Behind it are memories, fears, beliefs you've left untouched for years. The fear that opening them would bring disaster keeps you locked outside. The paradox deepens. The real curse of Tutankhamun wasn't in the tomb, it was in the minds of those who walked away from it, carrying the story. Even now, knowing the statistics, knowing the psychology, part of you still feels the weight of that doorway, still wonders, what if? That's how powerful narrative loops become. The human mind favors complete arcs over unresolved facts. This is reinforced by availability heuristic. Deaths linked to the tomb are easy to recall because they are dramatic. Lives lived in quiet health fade from memory. In experiments, people overestimate the frequency of events that are most vivid or emotional. Plane crashes, shark attacks, curses. And so the myth of Tutankhamun's curse becomes not just a story about Egypt, but about the way your own mind organizes reality. Patterns where there are none. Echoes where there is silence. Imagine now that final moment leaving the tomb, stepping back into the light, carrying nothing but the dust on your clothes and the story in your mind. How many other things in your life have followed that same arc? Small events transformed into larger patterns simply because you needed them to feel complete. The curse isn't a spell, it's a mirror. So as you drift deeper now, walking through your own silent corridors, ask yourself, if the tomb was only ever a room full of still air and gold, how many of your own dark doors remain closed? Not because of danger, but because of a story you told yourself long ago and never thought to question again. You stand before a wooden pyre, unlit for now, its rough beams stacked higher than your head. Around you, stone buildings lean in as if listening, silent faces watching from behind windows. In the center of the square stands a figure in armor, not a knight, but a girl, Joan of Arc. Her name drifts through history wrapped in flame and prayer. A peasant girl who rose to lead armies, only to be burned as a heretic. But as you step closer, a quieter question flickers beneath the surface. How much of what you know about her was shaped after the fire? Joan of Arc's story feels carved in stone. Divine visions, military triumph, trial, execution, sainthood. But historians reveal layers beneath that surface. Much of what we believe about Joan comes from chronicles written years, sometimes decades after her death. The records of her trial, the testimonies of those who knew her, were shaped as much by politics as by fact. This ties directly into a psychological effect called retrospective reconstruction. Cognitive scientists like Elizabeth Loftus have shown how memory, both personal and collective, is not a static recording but a story constantly rewritten. In Joan's case, early French sources emphasized her piety and military genius, while English accounts painted her as a dangerous witch. Over time, these extremes merged into a single mythic figure. Imagine now standing beside Joan as she rides into battle, but instead of a banner, she carries a mirror. In that mirror, two faces flicker, the saint and the sorceress, both real, both invented. The paradox deepens because both stories served a purpose, one for inspiration, one for condemnation. There's another layer, the halo effect. In psychology, this describes how one positive trait, like courage or charisma, colors how we perceive all other aspects of a person. Studies show that once someone is seen as heroic, we tend to overlook contradictions or flaws. Joan's brief military career, while remarkable, was marked by both victories and defeats. Yet the defeats fade from popular memory, eclipsed by her martyrdom. Now reflect on how this pattern applies inward. Think of the moments in your life defined by a single label: success, failure, hero, villain. How many of those labels were shaped not by the full story, but by the loudest part of it? Joan's visions are another point of paradox. She claimed to hear voices from saints and angels guiding her. Today, neurologists suggest possibilities ranging from epilepsy to auditory hallucination. Yet no diagnosis can fully capture the depth of her conviction. This mirrors what psychology calls the phenomenology of belief, the way deeply held beliefs feel undeniably real from the inside, even when they defy external logic. Imagine yourself hearing a voice no one else can hear. Is it madness or clarity beyond what others understand? Joan's life exists at that intersection between faith and doubt, certainty and silence. The loop continues in her trial. Condemned as a heretic, executed at 19, Joan was later retried posthumously. In 1456, the Catholic Church declared her innocent. By then she had already entered legend. This post-trial echoes a phenomenon called narrative redemption. Studies in psychology show how people reframe past events to find meaning, especially after trauma. A loss becomes a lesson. A failure becomes a step toward growth. Societies do this too. Joan's martyrdom became not just tragedy but symbol. Now imagine your own past, the trials you faced, literal or quiet. How many of them have you edited in hindsight? How many stories have you softened or sharpened to fit the version of yourself you want to carry forward? And here lies the quieter trap. The more we retell a story, the less connected we become to its raw truth. Joan of Arc is remembered less as a person and more as a concept, courage incarnate, faith embodied. But as with all myths, this simplicity erases her complexity, her doubts, her mistakes, her human contradictions. Even now, part of you still pictures her standing calm in the fire, face lit by more than flame. That's the strength of myth, it loops deeper than fact. There's one final layer: collective memory. Psychologists studying memory in groups find that shared narratives often override individual recollections. Entire cultures remember Joan not through documents but through paintings, statues, films. Her image floats above the details. And so the paradox becomes complete. Joan's story is both entirely real and entirely constructed, truth and legend intertwined so tightly they can no longer be separated. So tonight, as you drift deeper into sleep, walking through silent squares and shadowed cathedrals, ask yourself, if even a single life can become two different myths at once, how many of your own stories carry faces you've long since rewritten, both saint and sorcerer waiting quietly in the same mirror? You stand in a walled courtyard surrounded by crumbling stone, dust hanging motionless in the heavy air. Above you a flag flutters in slow motion, half-remembered colors blurred by heat and time. The Alamo. You've heard the phrase 1,000 times. Remember the Alamo. A final stand, a noble last breath. But as you walk through the silence, boots echoing against rough tiles, a quieter question surfaces. What were the real last words spoken here? And how much of what we remember was shaped afterward? The Battle of the Alamo, 1836. A group of Texan defenders, fewer than 200, held out against thousands of Mexican troops under General Santa Anna. They fought, history tells us, until the last man fell. But when historians look closer, the details blur. Some defenders may have surrendered, others may have fled and been cut down outside the walls. And most of the stories we know, Davy Crockett's final stand, Jim Bowie's last fight, come from accounts written weeks or years later, shaped by politics and legend. This ties into a psychological phenomenon called event boundary memory. Studied by researchers like Jeffrey Sachs, this effect shows how the mind naturally organizes experiences into chapters, closing each with a last moment even if none existed. We remember the final words in a conversation, the final look before goodbye, even when those moments were not as clear or dramatic as we recall. Now imagine yourself as one of the defenders inside the Alamo. You would not know which words would be your last. You would not know which moment would be the one carried forward in stories. That knowledge only comes afterward, when history is already being written. The paradox deepens when we consider the way stories like the Alamo are compressed into symbols. Remember the Alamo becomes not just a memory but a slogan used during the Texas Revolution and again in later American wars. Psychologists call this semantic encoding. The brain stores not full details but condensed meanings. The Alamo stands for courage, resistance, sacrifice. The specific truths fade behind the symbol. But there's another layer: collective reinforcement. In social psychology, studies show how repeated retelling within a group strengthens shared memory while gradually distorting specifics. By the time the Alamo had entered American schoolbooks, its story had hardened into a clean narrative: bravery without doubt, heroism without compromise. Imagine now walking the courtyard again. In the dust beneath your feet are quieter truths: a defender's fear, a whispered prayer, a plea for surrender. These don't fit the official version, so they vanish. Yet they are no less real. This mirrors a concept called narrative dominance. Introduced in cognitive science, it describes how a dominant story can suppress alternate versions of the same event. In experiments with eyewitness testimony, people shown edited film clips later remember only the emphasized details. Minor events fade. Think now about your own life, the arguments you've had, the successes and failures. How many of those moments have been edited in your mind to fit a cleaner narrative? We do it unconsciously, compressing memory to fit the shape of meaning rather than truth. The Alamo story loops deeper still. Historians now debate details once considered fact. Was Crockett killed in battle or executed after surrender? Did Bowie fight from his sickbed or was he already gone when the walls were breached? Multiple versions exist, all layered atop one another like stone upon stone. Even knowing this, part of you likely still sees the same scene, the final gunshot, the flag falling, silence. That's narrative closure. The human brain dislikes open endings. Studies show that unresolved stories trigger more cognitive stress than completed ones. We want to know what the last words were, even if those words never existed. And so the Alamo stands as both fact and myth. A real event, a constructed memory. A perfect example of how history becomes hypnotic, recursive, disorienting the longer it's repeated. Imagine again standing in that courtyard, this time as a visitor centuries later. Reading the plaques, hearing the guides. How many of the words you hear now were polished smooth long before you arrived? The quiet trap is not in remembering incorrectly. It's in believing memory is ever complete. So tonight, as you drift deeper into the quieter courtyards of your own mind, ask yourself, if even the last words of history's fiercest battles can be rewritten in silence, how many of your own endings are still open, waiting quietly for the next sentence to be written? You stand in a sunlit orchard, surrounded by quiet rows of blossoming trees. The air is still, carrying only the scent of cut wood and spring leaves. In front of you stands a small boy, no more than 6 or 7, holding a hatchet. At his feet, a young cherry tree lies cut through its middle. You've heard this scene before, George Washington, confessing to his father, "I cannot tell a lie," but as the boy's voice rises into the soft morning air, a quieter truth hangs beneath his words. What if the story was never true at all? The cherry tree story is one of the most famous American legends. It's been repeated in classrooms, books and monuments for over 2 centuries, but historians agree, it almost certainly never happened. The tale first appeared in 1806, in a biography by Mason Locke Weems. Weems's book was written not as strict history, but as moral instruction. He created the cherry tree story to emphasize Washington's honesty, painting him as the perfect example of virtue. This ties into a psychological pattern known as constructive memory. Elizabeth Loftus and others have shown how people don't simply retrieve memories, they reconstruct them, often filling gaps with details that fit their values or expectations. The cherry tree story filled a cultural gap. In the years following Washington's death, America needed not just a leader to remember, but a symbol. A perfect man, honest from the very beginning. Imagine now standing in that orchard again, watching as the boy steps back from the fallen tree. But this time, there's no father watching, no confession, only the quiet rustle of leaves. The scene is both real and unreal at once, a story built into the fabric of national identity, but woven from myth rather than fact. The paradox deepens when considering why such stories survive. It connects to a phenomenon called moral heuristics. Psychologists like Cass Sunstein have explored how people rely on simplified moral stories to guide behavior, especially in complex societies. A story like Washington's honesty becomes not just a tale but a teaching tool. Whether it happened or not becomes secondary to what it represents. Now reflect inward. How many stories from your own past carry similar weight? Lessons wrapped in memory. Moments you've shaped over time into cleaner, simpler arcs. Were those moments exactly as you remember them? Or have they been edited, polished like a stone worn smooth by years of retelling? There's another layer. Cultural script theory. Sociologists studying collective memory find that certain stories become so embedded in a society that individuals feel pressure to repeat them, even when aware they might be false. The cherry tree story is part of America's cultural script. School children recite it not because it's true, but because it fits. Imagine now a wider orchard. Not just Washington, but every figure in history carved into similar myths. Lincoln's honesty, Gandhi's peace, Einstein's childhood failures. Simplified, smooth stories repeated until they loop inside the mind as absolute truth. And yet the real George Washington was more complex. He was a soldier, a landowner, a man navigating moral contradictions, including owning slaves while preaching liberty. The cherry tree story, in its simplicity, erases that complexity. Psychologists call this reductionism, the tendency to shrink large, complicated realities into single traits or moments. The quiet trap here is not in believing myths, it's in allowing them to replace richer, messier truths. Think again about your own life. The lessons you carry. How many of them come from stories told so often you've forgotten where they began? Stories about yourself, about family, about success or failure. Like the cherry tree, they may stand as symbols long after their roots have faded. The recursive loop becomes clear. Belief shapes memory. Memory shapes identity. Identity shapes belief again. Just as Washington's honesty becomes part of the American self-image, so too do your personal myths become part of how you see yourself. Even knowing now that the cherry tree tale likely never happened, part of you still feels its shape, still sees the orchard, still hears the boy's voice. That's how strong narrative construction is. It loops deeper than fact. So tonight, as you drift through quieter orchards in your own mind, walking rows of half-remembered trees, ask yourself, if even history's simplest lessons were grown from stories rather than facts, how many of your own truths have been pruned and shaped into something cleaner, simpler? Leaving behind the real branches hidden beneath the leaves, you stand at the edge of a silent garden. Bamboo rustles lightly in the wind, stone lanterns glowing faintly under a pale moon. Before you kneels a lone figure, a samurai, wrapped in white robes, hands resting on the hilt of a short blade. His face is calm, his breath steady, and yet as the blade moves, the quiet question rises like incense in the night air. Was it always this way? Was the code of death before dishonor truly unbreakable? The image of the samurai is burned into global memory. Warriors bound by Bushido, the way of the warrior, choosing death over shame, loyalty over life. Tales of ritual suicide, seppuku, form the sharp edge of this myth, but historians and cultural scholars reveal something subtler beneath the surface. The idea of an absolute, rigid code of Bushido, dictating samurai behavior at all times, was largely shaped centuries after the samurai era had already begun to fade. During Japan's Edo period, 1603 to 1868, long after major wars had ended, samurai became more bureaucrats than warriors. The Bushido Code was written down and idealized in texts like the Hagakure by Yamamoto Tsunetomo. These writings reflected nostalgia for a fading warrior ideal rather than a strict historical reality. This ties directly into a psychological pattern called retrospective idealization. Cognitive scientists studying collective memory find that societies often romanticize past hardships or rules as stricter, purer, nobler than they actually were. It's a form of mental filtering, polishing rough history into smooth legend. Imagine now, standing not beside the samurai kneeling in the garden, but in a town long after peace has settled. Samurai walking with ledgers, not swords. Quiet clerks wrapped in armor they no longer use. The paradox deepens because both images are true. Samurai as warriors, and samurai as symbols trapped by their own myth. There's another layer, honor culture psychology. In regions where reputation matters more than law, like feudal Japan, or parts of the American South, people adopt strict personal codes, but studies by Richard Nisbet and others show these codes often emerge from necessity, not eternal truth. Samurai practice seppuku, not always because of unwavering Bushido, but because political structures demanded visible acts of loyalty. It was as much performance as belief. Now reflect inward. How many of your own personal rules feel absolute, unbreakable, yet were shaped by circumstances long since past? Silent vows made years ago, standards held long after they were needed. This is called identity freezing in psychology, when the self locks into a shape and refuses to adapt. Imagine again that quiet garden. But now, the samurai hesitates. His hand on the blade trembles. In real history, many samurai avoided seppuku, negotiated their fates, or lived quietly with dishonor. But these stories faded, replaced by cleaner, more symmetrical myths. The trap is recursive. The more often a rule is repeated, the more absolute it feels, even if history shows exceptions. Psychologists call this the absolutist heuristic. Studies show people overestimate the frequency of extreme behaviors in honor-based cultures, forgetting the quieter compromises that make up everyday life. Think now about your own life's silent codes. Promises you keep not because they serve you but because they fit the story you believe about who you are. The vow to always be strong, to never ask for help, to never forgive. These are modern echoes of Bushido personal myths solidified into armor. And like all armor, they can become too heavy to carry. Even now, knowing the historical complexity, part of you still sees that lone figure in white robes as pure, unbending. That's the power of simplified story loops. The mind favors clarity over contradiction. But real strength, both then and now, often comes from bending where needed. So tonight, as you drift deeper into your own silent gardens, bamboo rustling just beyond reach, ask yourself, If even the sharpest codes in history were softened by time and choice, how many of your own unbreakable rules are waiting quietly to be set down, blade and all, so you can finally walk free again? You stand in a dimly lit theater, rows of empty seats stretching into shadow. On the stage before you sits a single desk, a single quill resting in ink. Above the stage, a name, William Shakespeare. You've heard it all your life, poet, playwright, genius. But as the stage lights flicker, the name begins to blur. Letters rearrange themselves. Because beneath centuries of admiration, there's a quieter question still lingering. What if William Shakespeare wasn't the author at all? The Shakespeare authorship debate has haunted literary scholars for over a century. While mainstream historians accept that William Shakespeare of Stratford-upon-Avon wrote the plays attributed to him, a persistent undercurrent suggests otherwise. Some believe the true author was Edward de Vere, the 17th Earl of Oxford. Others suggest Francis Bacon, Christopher Marlowe, or a hidden collective of writers. Why? Because to many, Shakespeare's known background, modest education, provincial origins, seems at odds with the complexity of his work. This taps directly into a cognitive bias called the complexity assumption. Studies in psychology show that when faced with work perceived as sophisticated, people assume it must come from a background that matches. Shakespeare's simple biography clashes with the imagined grandeur of his plays, court life, foreign lands, legal knowledge. The mind rejects the mismatch and searches for a hidden hand. Now imagine standing on that theater stage yourself. You pick up the quill, feeling its weight. Whether it was William of Stratford or someone else, doesn't change the feel of ink on paper. And yet the myth loops on, because the mystery feels bigger than the answer. There's another psychological layer, the pattern completion effect. Humans are wired to seek complete narratives. In cognitive experiments, people shown fragmented information instinctively fill in the gaps. Shakespeare's biography is filled with gaps, missing years, unclear records, and so the mind fills them with grander possibilities. But the paradox deepens. The more scholars investigate alternative authors, the less agreement they find. Each theory contradicts the next, yet all persist in the collective imagination. This mirrors a concept called belief perseverance. Once a belief is adopted, it tends to survive even when disconfirmed by new evidence. Studies show people cling more tightly to debunked ideas if those ideas serve an emotional purpose. In the case of Shakespeare, that emotional purpose is control. If such towering art could emerge from a nobody, what does that mean for our ideas about talent, education, and genius? The authorship debate isn't just about history. It's about the stories we tell ourselves about human potential. Now reflect inward. How many of your own accomplishments have felt accidental? How many moments have you dismissed as not truly your own, assigning credit elsewhere, believing you were simply lucky or guided by unseen hands? Psychologists call this the imposter phenomenon, feeling like a fraud even in the presence of real achievement. Imagine again the quiet theater. You sit down at the desk. Whether your name is written above the stage or not, the words still flow from your hand. That's where the loop completes. Creation is real, even when the name attached to it is uncertain. Even now, knowing the weight of evidence supporting Shakespeare's authorship, part of you may still feel the question lingering. That's the recursive doubt effect, a cognitive loop where the presence of multiple explanations keeps the mind circling endlessly, never quite landing. There's also social proof at play. The more people publicly question Shakespeare's authorship, the more legitimate the question feels, regardless of the original evidence. Studies show group consensus can override individual skepticism, especially in ambiguous cases. Now imagine your own life stage. The roles you've played, the words you've written, the actions you've taken. How many of those feel fully yours? How many have been assigned to someone else in memory, credited to mentors, circumstances, or fate? And how many of your own invisible scripts have gone unsigned, waiting quietly in the background? The Shakespeare authorship debate isn't just about plays. It's about identity, about authorship in the broadest sense. Who writes your story, and who gets to claim it? So tonight, as you drift deeper into your own quiet theaters, rows of empty seats stretching into the dark, ask yourself, if even history's greatest words can stand without a name carved above them, how much of your own life script have you already written? Quietly, anonymously, without ever needing the world to know it was yours. You stand high in the mountains, clouds swirling around stone paths so narrow they seem to vanish into thin air. Under your feet, worn stones stretch onward, unmarked by signs, untouched by modern machines. No map shows them, no lines are drawn on the earth. Yet somehow, you know they are there. Inca roads, invisible to the untrained eye, yet sprawling across an empire. But as the mist clears, a quieter thought rises like the mountain wind. How many of history's greatest works survive not as monuments, but as things quietly hidden beneath everyday steps? The Inca Empire, before its fall to Spanish conquest in the 16th century, built one of the most sophisticated road systems in human history. Over 24,000 miles of roads, bridges, and tunnels crossing mountains, jungles, and deserts. Yet for centuries, these roads remained largely undocumented. Unlike Roman roads marked by arches and stones engraved with dates and names, Inca roads were humble, built with minimal surface markers, often blending into the landscape. This ties directly into a psychological phenomenon called the visibility bias. Human cognition favors things that stand out visually: bright colors, sharp shapes, marked signs. Studies show that we underestimate or overlook anything designed to blend in. The Inca roads were invisible, not because they didn't exist, but because they were designed to harmonize with the natural world. Imagine now walking along one of these roads yourself. The stones beneath your feet feel no different from the earth around them, yet they have guided travelers for centuries. Messengers, armies, merchants. This quiet persistence mirrors a deeper paradox. The most enduring systems in both nature and society often operate without demanding attention. There's another layer: distributed knowledge systems. In cognitive science, this describes how complex tasks or information are spread across a network rather than concentrated in one place. The Incas maintained their empire without written language as we know it, using quipas, knotted cords, to record data. Their road system functioned without maps in the European sense, knowledge passed orally, encoded in experience and tradition. Now reflect inward. How much of what you carry in your own mind operates in the background? Skills learned so deeply you no longer notice them. Paths walked so often you forget the steps. Psychologists call this automaticity. Once an action is practiced enough, it moves from conscious control to unconscious routine. Imagine again standing at a crossroads in the mountains. No signs, no arrows, yet somehow, you know which way to walk. That's what makes the Inca roads paradoxical. Their invisibility is their strength. They survive precisely because they don't demand attention. They are part of the landscape rather than set against it. The trap is recursive. The more visible a thing becomes, the more vulnerable it is to change, destruction, or manipulation. Quiet structures endure longer. This applies to human behavior too. Studies on social signaling show how visible status markers, luxury items, loud achievements, often decay faster than quieter forms of competence or connection. Think now about your own life's roads, the paths you walk every day, habits, routines, relationships. How many of those feel invisible because they've become part of your background? And how many deserve more attention than they receive? The paradox deepens further when considering how these roads were rediscovered. Modern archaeologists use satellite imagery and drone scans to trace routes that had blended perfectly into nature. The more technology advances, the more it reveals what was always there. This mirrors a cognitive concept called latent knowledge. Information or skills you carry without actively using them, waiting quietly until needed. Like the muscle memory that returns years after riding a bike, or a song lyric remembered suddenly after decades. Imagine again walking those quiet roads. This time you begin to notice details. Stones placed exactly so, drainage channels hidden beneath moss, patterns in the way turns align with mountain peaks. The deeper layer reveals itself only when you look slowly, carefully. Even now, knowing all this, part of you may still picture the Inca as builders of cities, Machu Picchu, grand temples. But the roads are their quieter legacy, stretching further than any single building. And so the loop completes. The most visible parts of history are often not its deepest truths. The roads beneath the surface carry more weight than the monuments towering above them. So tonight, as you drift deeper into your own quiet landscapes, walking roads mapped not on paper but in memory and habit, ask yourself, if the greatest empires built their paths to disappear into the earth rather than stand above it, how many of your own most important steps have already been taken on roads you can no longer see, but still carry you forward with every quiet breath? You stand beside a lake so still it looks like polished stone. Mist drifts low over the surface, hiding everything except a single ripple, then another. Far out on the water, something moves, a long shadow rising for just a moment before slipping beneath the waves again. The Loch Ness monster. You've seen the photos, heard the stories, but as the mist clears, the shape fades too. And the question lingers like the cold in your bones. If the monster was never real, why does part of you still believe? The legend of the Loch Ness monster is among the most famous cryptid myths in the world. The first modern sighting dates back to 1933, when a couple driving along the loch reported seeing a large creature crossing the road and slipping into the water. But the story truly gained global attention with a photograph, the infamous surgeon's photograph taken in 1934, showing what appeared to be a long neck and small head emerging from the lake's surface. Decades later, in 1994, it was revealed as a hoax. a model mounted on a toy submarine. And yet by that time, the monster had already taken root in the world's collective imagination. Tourist attractions, documentaries, endless retellings, Nessie was more real than ever. This ties into a psychological phenomenon called persistence of belief. Studies by Lee Ross and others show how once a belief is formed, especially if it triggers emotional or cultural resonance, it resists correction, even after clear disproof. The Loch Ness Monster isn't just an animal people want to believe in, it's a story people want to tell. Now imagine yourself standing at the edge of that lake, camera in hand. Even knowing the hoax, your eyes search the surface automatically. That's the paradox of expectation. When you expect to see something, your mind actively looks for patterns to confirm it. Cognitive scientists describe this as apophenia, finding meaning in random patterns. Shadows on the water become monsters, floating logs become proof. There's another layer: collective myth formation. In sociology, researchers have shown how communities bond through shared legends. The Loch Ness Monster is not just a belief, it's a local identity. For the people of the Scottish Highlands, Nessie is woven into tradition, economy, even personal history. Like all cultural myths, it serves a function beyond fact. Now reflect inward. How many quiet monsters live in your own mind? Fears, beliefs, memories you know are untrue, yet still feel real? Psychologists studying cognitive dissonance show that the human brain can hold contradictory ideas, believing and disbelieving something at once, simply because letting go would mean breaking a pattern that feels essential. Imagine now walking around the entire lake, mile after mile of silence. No monster appears, but the absence itself begins to feel like a presence. That's the silent confirmation loop. In experiments, even repeated non-events reinforce belief if the original story is strong enough. People rationalize the silence as part of the mystery. It only appears when no one is looking. The trap deepens with repetition bias. The more often you hear a story, the more likely you are to believe it. Researchers have demonstrated this effect in everything from advertising to folklore. And in Nessie's case, every retelling, every TV special, strengthens the shape of the monster in your mind. But here's the quieter truth. What makes the Loch Ness Monster matter isn't whether it's real. It's the space it fills inside us, a place where the unexplained still lives. In a world mapped by satellites, monitored by cameras, there's comfort in believing that some mysteries remain unsolved. Now think about your own Loch Ness. The parts of yourself you've left unexamined because they feel better as mysteries, habits you've never questioned, memories you've never checked against reality. In psychology, this is called identity anchoring. Certain beliefs about yourself become anchors, steadying points in an otherwise shifting world. Even knowing now that Nessie may only ever have been a shadow, part of you still wants to look back at the lake, still wants to see the ripple. That's the loop repeating, belief built not on proof, but on the need for something to remain just out of reach. So tonight, as you drift deeper into your own quiet lakes and mirrored waters, ask yourself, if even the clearest hoax can survive as a living truth in the mind, how many of your own long shadows are still rising and falling in places you've never fully dared to search? You stand in a desert so wide it feels like another planet. The sky stretches above you in silent gradients of fading blue and black. Sand shifts underfoot, marked only by scattered debris, small fragments of metal smooth and unnatural in shape. Somewhere out here the story begins, a flying saucer crashing in Roswell, New Mexico, 1947. But as the stars emerge overhead, a quieter realization settles into the dust. What if the real event wasn't what mattered? What if the myth itself became the truth? The Roswell incident is often called the origin point of modern UFO mythology. In July 1947, a local rancher discovered unusual wreckage scattered across his land. Metallic sheets, strange sticks, tape marked with symbols. The U.S. Army quickly announced it had recovered a flying disc, then retracted the statement, claiming it was a weather balloon. But the brief moment of uncertainty had already triggered something larger, the birth of a cultural legend. Decades later, in the late 1970s, new witnesses came forward claiming to have seen alien bodies recovered from the site. Books, documentaries, and films followed. The official explanation shifted again. In the 1990s, the U.S. government admitted that the debris came from Project Mogul, a classified Cold War experiment using balloon arrays to detect Soviet nuclear tests. But by then, Roswell's place in popular imagination was secured. Psychologists studying this phenomenon call it narrative persistence. Even after official clarifications, the first version of a story, especially one involving mystery or conspiracy, tends to stick. Studies by Stefan Lewandowski show that corrections often fail to fully erase misinformation, especially when that misinformation aligns with existing beliefs or cultural narratives. Imagine now standing among the scattered wreckage yourself. Your mind instinctively searches for patterns. What is real? What is cover-up? This connects directly to pattern-seeking bias. Human cognition evolved to spot potential threats and opportunities in ambiguous situations. In a desert full of empty space, the mind fills the void with shapes, ships, beings, secrets. There's another layer: collective memory formation. Sociologists describe how communities build shared histories not purely from fact, but from repeated, emotionally charged stories. For Roswell, this means annual UFO festivals, museums, and an entire subculture dedicated to preserving the mystery. The incident becomes not just a local event, but a touchstone for a larger belief in things unseen. Now reflect inward. How many Roswells exist inside your own life? Moments where a single misunderstanding or unsolved question shaped everything that came after. Psychology calls this anchoring bias. The first explanation you hear becomes the reference point against which all future information is judged. Imagine again walking through the desert at night, quiet except for wind and sand. Even knowing the Project Mogul explanation, part of you still glances upward, half expecting lights in the sky. This is the paradox: truth and myth looping together until neither can fully erase the other. Roswell also reflects a deeper human need for hidden layers. Psychologists studying conspiracy theory psychology find that belief in hidden truths often correlates with feelings of powerlessness or uncertainty. When the world feels too large, too chaotic, the mind reaches for a story where someone, somewhere, knows what's really going on, even if that someone is an alien civilization. The recursive trap emerges. Belief creates attention. Attention creates evidence. Every light in the sky becomes a sign. Every government denial becomes proof of secrecy. And the story feeds itself, round and round. Even now, knowing all this, part of you may still feel the pulse of possibility. That's what keeps Roswell alive. Not certainty, but potential. The desert remains empty and full at once. Think now about your own mind's deserts, the empty spaces where unanswered questions live. How many of those have been filled with your own quiet myths, stories you tell yourself because silence feels heavier than fiction? The paradox deepens further with what psychologists call the backfire effect. Attempts to debunk myths can actually reinforce belief, as people become more defensive of their original views. Roswell lives inside that effect. The more it's explained away, the more solid it feels. Imagine again the final scene, standing alone beneath a sky full of stars, each one a question mark, wreckage beneath your feet, history above your head. The story looping not just through books or films but through your own quiet thoughts. So tonight, as you drift deeper into sleep, walking across your own internal deserts, ask yourself, if even the clearest explanations can never fully erase the first myth, how many of your own truths are waiting quietly beneath layers of silence and belief, half buried in the sand, never fully seen, but never fully forgotten either? You stand in the middle of a narrow street, wooden houses rising tall and crooked on either side, smoke curls from unseen windows. The air is sharp with heat and panic. Behind you bells ring out, not for celebration but for warning, and as flames leap from roof to roof, turning sky to ash, a question forms quietly in the back of your mind. Was this really an accident? Or was there something or someone hiding in the fire? The Great Fire of London began on September 10, 1666. It started in a small bakery on Pudding Lane, and within days, consumed much of the medieval city, over 13,000 houses, 87 churches, and countless businesses reduced to cinders. Official records marked it as an unfortunate accident, a spark from an unattended oven, but almost as soon as the flames died down, rumors spread. Whispers of sabotage, foreign agents, and hidden plots took hold. Many Londoners believed the fire was not chance, but conspiracy. This ties directly into a psychological phenomenon called proportionality bias. Cognitive scientists like Daniel Kahneman have shown how people instinctively search for causes that match the scale of an event. A vast disaster feels too large for a small mundane cause. The mind resists imbalance. A bakery spark destroying an entire city? It feels incomplete, so the story grows. Imagine standing now in the ruins of London, ash falling like snow. In this silence, the human mind fills the void with names. French spies, Catholic plots, Dutch saboteurs. Someone must be responsible. This mirrors another bias, agent detection. Our brains evolved to spot intentional agents in chaotic situations. In the wild, hearing a rustle might mean wind or a predator. So in disasters, we look for hidden hands. There's another layer. Collective trauma processing. Psychologists studying post-disaster behavior find that conspiracy theories often emerge as coping mechanisms. They provide structure where reality feels random. For Londoners in 1666, already reeling from plague and war, The fire wasn't just flames, it was the final spark in an already burning world. Now reflect inward. How many personal disasters in your own life have felt too large to accept as random? Relationships ending, plans collapsing, minds instinctively weave explanations that feel proportional. This is called meaning-making bias. We assign narratives where there may be none. Historical records show how quickly the Great Fire conspiracy spread. Foreigners were attacked in the streets, French and Dutch immigrants were blamed, and even killed. Later investigations found no evidence, but the damage was done, not by fire, but by story. The paradox deepens. The more often a narrative is repeated, the more real it feels. This is the illusory truth effect. Studies show that repeated statements are more likely to be judged as true, even when false. London's fires weren't just physical, they became mental loops, burning through memory and belief. Imagine again walking those same streets, but now centuries later. Tourists pass by, cameras clicking, signs mark Pudding Lane. The story feels smaller now, historical, safe, but under that quiet, the same loops still exist in modern disasters, from pandemics to blackouts to market crashes. People search for hidden causes, unable to accept silence. Even now, knowing the official cause, part of you may still feel that question lingering. What if? That's how deeply narrative patterns embed themselves in the mind. Truth doesn't always overwrite myth. There's also something called historical anchoring. Cognitive researchers show how early accounts of an event shape all future versions. Samuel Pepys' famous diary entries during the fire helped immortalize its drama. But his writings also spread early rumors, like foreign saboteurs, that historians now view as unfounded. Think now about your own past again. How many of your strongest beliefs about what happened, why things failed, why things hurt, were shaped not by fact but by early impressions, by the first story you told yourself, or the first one someone else offered? The Great Fire of London's conspiracy theories became part of its legacy. They weren't erased by official records or royal proclamations. They survived because they filled a psychological gap too large for silence. And so the loop completes. Large fires, small sparks, simple causes, complicated meanings. The mind returns again and again to balance the scale. So tonight, as you drift deeper into quieter streets, walking ruins both real and imagined, ask yourself, if even the simplest spark can grow into a fire that lives forever in the mind, how many of your own quiet flames are still burning, not because they never went out, but because your mind keeps searching for the one hidden match it can never quite find? You stand at the edge of a cliff overlooking a gray sea. Below, jagged rocks catch the tide like teeth. Behind you, stone walls rise, cold, silent, holding stories no one was meant to hear. The Château d'If, a prison. The name echoes in your mind. The Count of Monte Cristo, a man wrongly imprisoned. A man who escaped, seeking revenge and redemption. But as the waves crash below, a quieter thought moves like the tide beneath your feet. What if the real story wasn't entirely fiction? Alexandre Dumas' novel, The Count of Monte Cristo, published in 1844, is often assumed to be pure invention, but its core was inspired by a real man, Pierre Picot. A shoemaker in early 19th century France, Picot was betrayed by jealous friends who accused him of spying. He was imprisoned for years without trial. During that time, according to court records, he befriended a dying priest who revealed the location of hidden treasure. When Picot was finally released, he spent the rest of his life methodically enacting revenge on those who had wronged him. This connection ties into a psychological pattern called source blending. Cognitive psychologists describe how real and fictional memories often merge in the mind, especially when both share emotional weight. Over generations, Pierre Picot's story and Dumas' novel fused into a single cultural myth. Imagine standing now inside one of those prison cells, the walls damp with time. You see no treasure map, no secret tunnel, only silence. But the mind's need for narrative fills the emptiness. This is narrative completion bias. Faced with incomplete or unjust stories, human cognition instinctively creates cleaner, more satisfying versions. A man wronged must triumph, a secret must be revealed, justice must balance. There's another layer, the escapist paradox. In studies on reading and film, psychologists find that people are drawn to stories of imprisonment and escape, not just for adventure, but as symbolic reflections of inner life. The cell becomes a metaphor for the invisible cages we all carry, regrets, limitations, roles we no longer fit but can't seem to leave. Now reflect inward. How many quiet cells have you built around yourself? Habits, fears, assumptions inherited from others. Psychologists call this self-imposed limitation. Patterns so old they feel like walls. The paradox deepens with the idea of hidden treasure. In both Picard's real life and Dumas's novel, the treasure serves as both catalyst and trap. It empowers revenge but also consumes years of life. This mirrors what psychologists call goal entrapment, the phenomenon where pursuing a goal, revenge, success, perfection becomes self-perpetuating, even when it no longer serves its original purpose. Imagine again standing at the edge of that cliff, wind tearing at your coat, the sea below endlessly moving. You've escaped, perhaps, but now what? In real life, Pierre Picot's story ends not with peace, but with shadows. His revenge complete, he disappears from record. Victory often comes not with clarity, but with emptiness. There's also the memory halo effect. Because Dumas's novel was so popular, its polished version of events overshadows the messier real story. Even in official records, the lines blur between Picard's reality and Edmond Dantes's fiction. The human mind prefers the legend to the truth. Think again about your own victories, big or small. How many of them were followed not by triumph but by quiet, by wondering what comes next after the walls come down? The real Count of Monte Cristo isn't just a man. He's a loop. Wronged, imprisoned, freed, lost. And the story repeats across lives, across generations. Even now, knowing the quieter truth behind the novel, part of you still hears the name as legend, not history. That's the recursive myth effect. When a story is told often enough, its origin becomes irrelevant. It lives on its own. So tonight, as you drift deeper into your own quiet fortresses, walking halls carved not from stone but from memory, ask yourself, if even the greatest escape in history ended with the same silent question, how many of your own walls have already fallen without you realizing, leaving only open sky and the choice of which road to walk next? You stand in a grand hall, the air heavy with the scent of polished wood and cold iron. Along the walls, banners flutter gently, lions, eagles, crosses, and at the center, a knight kneels before a throne, sword laid across his shoulders in silent blessing. Chivalry, honor, courage, the perfect knight. But as the torchlight flickers and shadows bend, a quieter thought moves beneath the armor. Was it ever really like this? The idea of chivalry dominates how we remember medieval Europe. Knights in shining armor protecting the weak, defending virtue, living by an unbreakable code of honor. But historians, digging past legend and romance, uncover a more complicated truth. The real medieval knight was often as ruthless as he was noble, raiding villages, seizing land, enforcing brutal rule. Chivalry as we know it was largely a literary invention, shaped long after the battles had ended. This connects directly to a psychological phenomenon called idealization bias. When looking back on history or even personal memory, the mind filters out contradictions to preserve a cleaner, simpler story. Researchers like Daniel Kahneman have shown how people tend to exaggerate positive traits while erasing negative details, especially when those traits align with cultural values. Imagine now standing beside one of those knights, not in a polished hall but on a muddy field, his armor dented, blood smeared across steel. The myth fades, the reality returns. Chivalry wasn't a universal code, but a shifting set of expectations, often ignored in practice. There's another layer, the halo effect. Psychologists studying reputation show how a single admired trait, bravery, loyalty, colors how we see every other behavior. Medieval knights might have been brave in battle, but that didn't make them just or kind outside of it. Yet the title knight still triggers automatic respect. Now reflect inward. How many people in your own life, or even parts of yourself, have you idealized in the same way, ignoring flaws because the label feels too strong to question? Teacher, leader, hero. Psychologists call this role anchoring, assigning someone a fixed identity and filtering all new information through that lens. The paradox deepens with the role of literature. Books like La Morte d'Arthur by Thomas Malory or The Song of Roland helped craft the image of the chivalrous knight. But these works were often written centuries after the events they described. Their purpose wasn't to report reality, it was to shape cultural values during times of uncertainty. Chivalry as a story helped stabilize a society grappling with war and change. Imagine again walking through that grand hall, but this time noticing cracks in the banners, rust on the swords. Symbols remain bright long after the realities behind them have faded. This mirrors the psychological concept of symbolic persistence. Once a symbol takes hold, whether personal or cultural, it tends to outlive its original context. Think now about your own personal codes, rules you try to live by. Are they rooted in current reality or inherited from stories long past their use? Many people carry silent vows without questioning where they came from. Psychologists call this legacy conditioning, behaviors passed down through generations or institutions that no longer serve their original purpose. Even now, knowing the quieter truth, part of you likely still imagines the knight in shining armor, sword raised against injustice, That's the recursive myth loop, repeating an image until it feels more real than the messier details beneath it. There's another layer, cognitive dissonance. When faced with information that contradicts a cherished belief, the mind often doubles down on the belief, instead of adapting. This helps explain why the myth of chivalry survives so strongly, despite clear historical evidence to the contrary. Imagine one final time standing in that hall, alone now. No knights, no banners, only echoes of footsteps long gone. The story remains because we need it, not just to remember the past, but to shape how we think about strength, loyalty, and honor in ourselves. So tonight, as you drift deeper into your own quiet castles of thought, ask yourself, if even the most polished codes in history were written not in action but in memory, how many of your own unbreakable rules are quietly waiting to be rewritten? Not by history, but by the quieter truth of who you've already become. You stand in the middle of an ancient arena. Stone arches rise around you, packed with thousands of silent faces. The sun burns high above, casting sharp shadows across the sand. At your feet, a fallen figure waits, his breath shallow, eyes turned upward, waiting for a single gesture. The emperor stands. His hand rises, a thumb moves. And in your mind, you already know the story. Thumbs up, the gladiator lives. Thumbs down, he dies. But as the sunlight flickers through dust and heat, a quieter question forms. What if the gesture was never what we thought it was? The idea that Roman crowds decided a gladiator's fate with a thumbs up or thumbs down signal is burned into popular imagination. Films, paintings, history books, all repeat it. But historians and archaeologists reveal something subtler. Ancient texts, such as those by the Roman poet Juvenal or historian Suetonius, suggest that the reality was more complicated. Pollice verso, the Latin phrase often translated as with turned thumb, doesn't clearly indicate which direction the thumb pointed. In fact, some scholars argue that a thumb pressed against the fist or hidden in the hand was the real sign for mercy. An extended thumb, signaling a sword's thrust, could mean death. But over centuries, translations blurred. Renaissance painters depicted emperors giving dramatic gestures. Artists added clarity where the original was ambiguous, and modern culture locked the myth in place. This ties into a psychological phenomenon called closure bias. The human mind dislikes unresolved signals. Ambiguity triggers stress. Studies by Ari Kruglansky show how people prefer firm answers, even when those answers are less accurate, because certainty feels safer than uncertainty. Imagine standing now in that same arena again. But this time you realize, no one is quite sure which gesture means what. The crowd watches, breath held, guessing as much as deciding. The paradox deepens. The symbol that became so clear to us was, in truth, built on centuries of interpretation layered over uncertainty. There's another layer, the gestural memory effect. Cognitive scientists studying nonverbal communication show how easily societies assign fixed meanings to gestures, meanings that change dramatically across cultures and time. A thumbs up today means approval, but in other places or centuries it has meant something entirely different. Yet once a symbol is locked into a story, it persists. Now reflect inward. How many signals in your own life have you assigned meaning without ever checking their origin? A raised voice interpreted as anger. A quiet silence as rejection. Psychologists call this assumed intention bias. The mind fills in gaps about others' behaviors based on past experience rather than direct evidence. Imagine again the fallen gladiator beneath your feet. His fate hinging not on certainty but on perception. What the emperor believes the crowd means, what the crowd believes the emperor means. A loop of signals and echoes. The trap is recursive. The clearer a symbol feels, the more likely we are to overlook its ambiguity. This mirrors the illusory clarity effect. Experiments show how people often mistake repetition and cultural reinforcement for universal truth. Think now about your own personal gestures, small habits, repeated reactions, things you do without thinking. How many of them carry meanings that no longer fit their original purpose? A smile used to hide discomfort, a shrug meant to avoid deeper questions. Even now, knowing all this, part of you likely still pictures the emperor's thumb pointing up or down with absolute power. That's the recursive narrative loop again. Myths reinforced not because they are true, but because they fill a human need for clarity and control. There's another layer, social synchronization. In group settings, people instinctively mirror each other's gestures and decisions, often without conscious thought. The Roman arena wasn't just one person deciding. It was a crowd moving as a single organism, each member looking to the next for cues. Imagine now walking away from that arena, back into quieter streets. The gesture still hangs in the air behind you, echoing even though its true meaning was never fixed. That's how myths outlive facts, by becoming part of a shared script repeated long after the original actors have left the stage. So tonight, As you drift deeper into your own arenas of thought, walking paths where gestures and signals float quietly through memory, ask yourself, if even the sharpest signals in history were shaped more by repetition than truth, how many of your own silent decisions have been guided not by clear meaning, but by gestures you never fully understood, yet followed all the same?
You stand on a beach at dawn. The horizon glows faintly, the sky bleeding from black into pale gold. In your hand, a mapege is burned, lines drawn in shaking ink. X marks the spot, a red cross where treasure waits. You know the story already. Pirates hiding their gold, leaving behind secret maps for those daring enough to search. But as the tide creeps in and washes the sand clean, a quieter thought settles in your mind. What if that map was never real? What if the X was always meant for your imagination, not for your hands? The image of pirates burying treasure and leaving cryptic maps is one of history's most enduring myths. It lives in films, novels, and theme parks. Yet historians reveal a quieter truth. There is little to no historical evidence that real pirates ever buried treasure this way. The concept was largely popularized by fiction, most notably Robert Louis Stevenson's 1883 novel, Treasure Island. This ties directly into a psychological phenomenon called constructive storytelling. Cognitive scientists studying memory formation show how narratives that contain clear symbols, like a map with an XR, easier for the brain to encode and recall. Complex realities fade. Simple stories endure. Imagine now walking across that beach again, map in hand. You know there's nothing beneath the sand, yet the urge to dig is still there. That's symbol-driven motivation. In studies, researchers found that even abstract symbols, lines on paper, marks on walls, can trigger real physical actions, simply because of the way the brain links signs with outcomes. There's another layer: false memory implantation. Elizabeth Loftus demonstrated how easily memories can be manipulated using suggestive cues. A treasure map functions in much the same way a visual trigger that creates a memory-like experience, even if no real treasure exists. The X doesn't just mark a spot, it marks belief. Now reflect inward. How many maps exist inside your own mind? Quiet plans, imagined goals, promises left half buried. Psychologists call this goal visualization. Mental maps drawn from childhood, from culture, from old habits. The paradox deepens. In reality, most pirate wealth was spent quickly. Weapons, supplies, or luxuries. There was little reason to bury it. Yet the image of hidden chests persists because it satisfies a deeper narrative need. The idea that value is waiting somewhere, just out of reach. Imagine now unrolling that map again, but this time the lines are less clear. The X fades into smudges. The deeper trap emerges. The more often you chase a symbol, the less certain you become whether the treasure was real or imagined. This mirrors a cognitive pattern called the endowment effect. Once people invest effort into a belief or quest like following a treasure map, they value the process more, even if the outcome proves empty. Studies show how sunk cost bias leads individuals to continue searching, digging, hoping. Think again about your own life's treasure hunts. Projects started and abandoned, relationships sought and lost. How many of those were guided not by concrete rewards, but by quiet X's drawn somewhere inside your mind long ago? Even now, knowing the quieter truth, part of you still pictures the chest buried beneath the sand, the map folded in a leather pouch. That's narrative persistence. Myths that survive, not because they're true, but because they're needed. There's another layer. collective imaginary objects. Sociologists studying cultural myths find that objects like pirate treasure maps belong to a category of useful fictions, shared stories that help societies bond, even when no physical object exists. The map exists because we agree it does. Imagine one last time standing on that beach, this time without a map, just sand, sky, and sea. The treasure is not beneath the ground. It never was. It's in the walking, in the searching, in the belief that something might still be there. So tonight, as you drift deeper into quieter maps of your own making, ask yourself if even history's clearest X was always drawn for the mind, not the hands. How many of your own silent searches have already uncovered what you were looking for, long before you reached the place where the map said it would be found? You stand beneath a tall white dome, light slanting through marble pillars. Statues line the hall, names carved in stone: Washington, Jefferson, Franklin. Their words echo in quiet inscriptions: liberty, equality, freedom for all. You know the story. The founding fathers of the United States created a new world based on these ideals. But as your footsteps fade into the silence, a quieter thought presses against the walls. Was it ever really freedom for everyone? The phrase freedom for all is woven into American identity. It appears in speeches, textbooks, songs, yet history reveals a layered paradox. Many of the men who wrote and signed the Declaration of Independence, proclaiming that all men are created equal, owned slaves. Thomas Jefferson, who drafted those words, kept over 600 enslaved people during his lifetime. George Washington did as well. This ties into a psychological phenomenon called cognitive dissonance. First studied by Leon Festinger, it describes the tension that arises when someone holds two conflicting beliefs or behaviors. The Founding Fathers believed in liberty, yet practiced ownership. The human mind, faced with such contradictions, instinctively tries to resolve or ignore them. Imagine standing now in Jefferson's Monticello, walking past the grand columns and polished wood. Behind the main house, smaller quarters were enslaved. People lived and worked quiet, shadows in a story otherwise carved in marble. There's another layer: selective memory formation. In cultural psychology, researchers show how societies construct collective memory by emphasizing some details while erasing others. The hero becomes brighter. The contradictions blur into the background. For generations, school books minimized or ignored the founders' involvement in slavery to preserve a cleaner national myth. Think now about your own life's stories. How many moments have you edited over time, focusing on successes while smoothing away failures? This is called narrative filtering. People unconsciously highlight experiences that fit their self-image, while reducing focus on moments that conflict. The paradox deepens. The United States founding documents created both a Declaration of Universal Rights and a structure that excluded women, indigenous peoples, and enslaved Africans. This duality wasn't an accident, it was a design shaped by historical context and power. Dynamics. Imagine again standing in that marble hall, reading the words "freedom for all" while hearing echoes of footsteps that were never allowed through its doors. Psychologists studying group identity theory find that nations often maintain unity by simplifying their origin stories. The founding fathers become symbols rather than complex individuals. This process, called identity simplification, helps communities feel coherent even when their histories are fractured. Now reflect on your own silent contradictions, personal values you believe in but don't always live by, promises you make to yourself but quietly set aside. The mind's ability to hold both truth and illusion mirrors the dual reality of history. There's also the concept of moral licensing. Studies show that when people perform one good act, they sometimes feel justified in ignoring other moral standards. The founders may have viewed their revolutionary work as outweighing the contradictions of slavery and exclusion. Even now, knowing this deeper history, part of you may still feel the weight of those marble statues as symbols of pure ideals. That's the recursive myth effect. The more a story is told, the more its cleaner version becomes the default in the mind. Imagine one final moment, standing not in marble halls, but at a quiet field where those left out of freedom for all once walked. Their names their stories unwritten. The founding fathers remain both architects of liberty and participants in its limits. That's the paradox. History as a double mirror, showing both what was intended and what was denied. So tonight, as you drift deeper into your own silent halls of memory and belief, ask yourself if even the clearest declarations of freedom were written in shadows as much as light. How many of your own quiet promises carry echoes you've chosen not to hear, waiting quietly behind doors you've yet to open fully? You stand in a candlelit room, its walls lined with ancient symbols, pyramids, all-seeing eyes, serpents eating their own tails. In the center, a circle of empty chairs, as if some secret meeting has just ended. You've heard the whispers, all. Your life, the Illuminati, a hidden society controlling governments, media, and minds. But as the candles flicker, a quieter question rises like smoke through the air. What if the real power of the Illuminati wasn't in what they did, but in how much you believe they exist? The idea of the Illuminati as a global puppet master is one of the world's most enduring conspiracy theories. Yet the historical Illuminati was reland far smaller than the myth suggests. Founded in 1776 in Bavaria by Adam Weishaupt, the Order of the Illuminati was a short-lived group aiming to promote Enlightenment ideals and secular governance. It was disbanded by Bavarian authorities within a decade. No confirmed traces of its operations survived beyond the late 1700s. So how did it become a legend? Psychologists studying collective fear amplification find a pattern, the less visible. A group or idea is, the more room the mind has to expand its size. The Illuminati became a perfect cognitive mirror, invisible explanation for everything too large or too chaotic to understand. Imagine now, sitting in one of those empty chairs. You look around, waiting for the hidden hand to reveal itself. But nothing comes. Only your own reflection in dark glass. This ties directly into agency detection bias. Human cognition evolved to assume that events have intentional causes, rather than randomness. When lightning strikes, someone must have aimed it. When economies collapse, someone must have engineered it. Studies show people will assign agency even to completely random patterns if the outcome feels emotionally significant. There's another layer, information gap theory. Introduced by George Lowenstein, it describes the tension the brain feels when presented with partial information. A half-heard rumor, a redacted document, a blurred face. These gaps drive the mind to fill in the rest, often inventing larger forces than actually exist. Now reflect inward. How many hidden Illuminatis live inside your own mind? quiet forces you've assigned blame to for things that never had a single cause: failures, missed opportunities, bad luck. Psychologists call this personal conspiracy thinking. The belief that life's twists are part of some larger, unseen design rather than the result of many small factors. Imagine again standing in that room. But now the walls begin to dissolve. The symbols fade. You realize the real structure wasn't in the room. It was in your own thoughts. That's the loop. The more you believe in a secret controlling force, the more tightly it grips your perception, even if it doesn't exist. The Illuminati myth was amplified in the 20th century by books like the Illuminatus trilogy and countless online forums. Researchers studying mass suggestibility show how repeated exposure to an idea increases belief in it, even without direct evidence. That's called the mere exposure effect. And here lies the deeper trap. The Illuminati became not just a fear machine, but a self-protecting narrative. Any attempt to disprove it is seen as part of the conspiracy. Psychologists describe this as the closed-loop belief system. Any contradiction is absorbed as further confirmation. Think now about your own mental loops, stories you tell yourself about why things happen the way they do. Are they based on visible facts or on invisible patterns you've quietly assembled over years? Even now, knowing the historical facts, part of you may still feel the quiet weight of that empty chair, waiting for some unseen hand to move. That's the recursive fear effect. Once the mind opens the door to hidden forces, closing it again becomes almost impossible. There's another layer: social identity theory. Believing in shared hidden knowledge, like the Illuminati, creates in-groups and out-groups, those who know the truth and those who don't. This psychological divide helps reinforce belief even against overwhelming contradictory evidence. Imagine one final time walking out of that candlelit room. But as you leave, you realize the real meeting wasn't held there. It was held in your own mind all along. So tonight, as you drift deeper into quiet halls filled with flickering lights and half-seen symbols, ask yourself if even the clearest signs of control were created more by belief than by fact. How many of your own unseen forces are waiting quietly, not in secret rooms, but in the quiet spaces between your own thoughts, shaped by echoes you chose to follow? You stand in a quiet gallery beneath vaulted ceilings, the air cool and still. Before you hangs a painting known across the world, The Last Supper. But as your eyes move across the figures seated at the table, as your gaze lingers on hidden hands, cryptic glances, and shadows between folds of cloth, a quieter thought stirs. What if this painting and Leonardo da Vinci himself were part of a hidden code? What if there was always a secret society moving quietly behind the brushstrokes? The belief that Da Vinci belonged to or encoded messages for secret societies, such as the Priory of Sion or the Knights Templar, is a myth that has captured imaginations for decades. Books like the Da Vinci Code turned this idea into a global phenomenon. But historians studying Leonardo's life find no concrete evidence connecting him to any real clandestine orders. The Priory of Sion itself was revealed as a hoax in the 20th century, created by Frenchman Pierre Planted, yet the belief endures. This ties directly into a psychological concept called pattern completion bias. The human brain, when confronted with complex or ambiguous information, instinctively fills in gaps with patterns, especially ones that feel emotionally charged. The more intricate Leonardo's works appear, the more likely our minds are to see hidden messages where there may be none. Imagine now standing even closer to the painting, tracing the brush lines with your eyes. Every fold of fabric feels like a puzzle. Every shadow feels deliberate. But how much of that is real land? How much is your own mind assembling a picture it wants to find? There's another layer, the legend. Enhancement effect. Cognitive scientists studying the spread of folklore find that stories involving secret knowledge spread faster and last longer than those involving ordinary facts. The mystery becomes self-reinforcing. Even when the hoax of the Priory of Sion was exposed, belief in a hidden society behind Da Vinci continued because it satisfied a deeper narrative hunger. Now reflect inward. How many quiet codes exist in your own life? Silent beliefs you've built over time, connecting unrelated events because the pattern felt safer than randomness. Psychologists call this constructed coherence, the mind's natural habit of stitching together meaning where there may be none. The paradox deepens when considering Da Vinci's actual personality. He was known for secrecy, but not of a conspiratorial kind. He kept notebooks written in mirror script, filled with inventions and ideas far ahead of his time. Yet historians suggest these were simply personal habits, not evidence of hidden allegiances. His secrecy was practical, not political. Imagine again standing in a room filled with Leonardo's sketches, flying machines, anatomical drawings. Impossible. Gears. The real wonder is not in hidden societies, but in the mind that created these things alone. And yet the myth persists because it makes the story easier to believe. This mirrors what psychologists call narrative simplification. When faced with a complex figure like Leonardo, the mind often chooses the clearest story over the truest one. Genius inventor becomes secret society member because it explains the unexplainable. Think now about your own quiet creations, things you've done or made that others may have misunderstood, assigning meanings or motives you never intended. Everyone carries unseen notebooks, plans, hopes, memories locked away. Even now, knowing the Priory of Sion was fabricated, part of you may still feel the pull of the idea that somewhere beneath the paint and stone there's more. That's the recursive puzzle effect. Once a puzzle is introduced, the mind struggles to let it go even if the pieces don't fit. There's also the social projection effect. Believing in secret societies behind Da Vinci reflects a larger belief that great things, great art, great science must come from great networks rather than individuals. It's easier to imagine an organization than one solitary mind holding so much. Imagine one final moment, walking out of the gallery, the painting still glowing faintly behind you. The story doesn't end with proof. It ends with choice, choosing which version of reality to carry forward. So tonight, as you drift deeper into your own quiet archives of thought, sketchbooks and symbols flickering in shadow, ask yourself, if even the clearest masterpieces in history were shaped more by our need for mystery than by hidden hands, how many of your own quiet works already carry more meaning than anyone else will ever see? Not because you hid it, but because others were always looking for a secret that was never really there. You stand on the deck of an ancient ship, sails torn by salt and wind. The sky burns orange, the sea below you endless and dark, and at the helm stands a figure tall, wild-eyed, smoke rising from slow-burning fuses tied into his beard. Blackbeard. Edward Teach. You already know his legend, the most fearsome pirate to ever sail the seas. But as the horizon blurs between light and shadow, a quieter thought drifts across your mind. What if most of what you know about Blackbeard was never real? Blackbeard's image as a ruthless pirate captain, lighting fuses in his beard to terrify enemies, has dominated folklore and film for centuries. Yet historical records paint a more complex, often quieter figure. According to primary accounts from the early 18th century, including official Navy logs and trial transcripts, Blackbeard may have relied more on reputation than violence. Though feared, there is little evidence he actually killed many people. Outside of direct combat, this ties directly into the psychological phenomenon known as reputational amplification. Studies in social psychology show that once a person earns a reputation, whether for kindness or cruelty, stories about them begin to grow, regardless of fact. In Blackbeard's case, the British government and colonial press had strong incentives to exaggerate his terror in order to justify their anti-piracy campaigns. Imagine now standing beside Blackbeard himself, not during battle, but on a quiet morning. No smoke, no flames, just a man with careful control over his appearance, understanding that terror could win fights before swords were ever drawn. This mirrors what psychologists call perception management, the deliberate crafting of image to influence behavior. Blackbeard was perhaps less a monster, more a master of psychological warfare. There's another layer: memory distortion through repetition. Cognitive scientists like Elizabeth Loftus have shown how the human mind alters memories each time they are recalled. Each retelling of Blackbeard's story shaped him into something larger, darker, more theatrical than he might have been. Now, reflect inward. How many of your own monsters have been shaped not by fact, but by repeated stories, either told by others or by yourself? Psychologists call this internalized mythology, when repeated thoughts about our own strengths or weaknesses become so ingrained they feel like absolute truth. The paradox deepens. Blackbeard's ship, the Queen Anne's Revenge, has been found and studied. Artifacts suggest he was organized, disciplined, even restrained in comparison to other pirates of his time. Yet the image survives, a wild-eyed figure, laughing as ships burn around him. Imagine again standing on the edge of his ship's deck, watching not a battle, but negotiations, letters exchanged, deals made. Historians now believe Blackbeard often avoided unnecessary bloodshed through intimidation rather than force. This mirrors another psychological pattern called fear conditioning. Once a threat is perceived, it doesn't take repeated proof to keep the fear alive. The memory loops on its own. Think about your own life's fears now. How many of them were formed by a single sharp moment? And how many have continued simply because you never stopped repeating them inside your mind? Even now, knowing the quieter truths behind Blackbeard, part of you may still see him as the archetypal pirate. That's the recursive archetype effect. Cultural stories becoming so ingrained they overwrite individual memory. There's another layer. Social proof. Blackbeard's legend grew faster because others believed it. Crew members, victims, and governments all spread tales that solidified his myth, creating a feedback loop. In studies, researchers show how people adopt beliefs faster when they perceive others already holding them. Imagine, now stepping off Blackbeard's ship, watching it sail quietly into mist. Less a monster, more a symbol crafted, as much by silence as by action. So tonight, as you drift deeper into your own quiet oceans, navigating between legends and quieter truths, ask yourself if even history's most feared shadows were shaped more by image than reality. How many of your own loudest fears have already vanished over the horizon, leaving only echoes shaped by stories you chose to keep telling yourself? You stand in a cobblestone square beneath a sky heavy with grey clouds. Ahead of you, a wooden scaffold rises. At its center stands the guillotine, tall, sharp, silent. The blade gleams cold in the morning light. You've seen it in paintings, films, and books, the ultimate symbol of the French Revolution, where thousands of heads fell in the name of liberty, equality, and fraternity. But as the crowd shifts and murmurs around you, a quieter thought drifts in like autumn wind. What if the story of the guillotine wasn't quite what you believed? The guillotine is remembered as the defining image of the Reign of Terror period between 1793 and 1794, during which revolutionary leaders executed enemies of the new republic. Popular accounts often claim tens of thousands were sent to their deaths beneath the blade. But historians reveal a more layered truth. While the guillotine was indeed used widely during the Revolution, the numbers and its symbolic weight have been magnified far beyond their historical scale. Official records show that approximately 16,500 people were executed by guillotine during the Terror, with about 2,600 of those in Paris. This is a staggering number, but not the waves of daily public executions that films and folklore suggest. The idea of the guillotine as an endlessly falling blade was shaped over decades through literature, political propaganda, and collective memory. This ties into a psychological phenomenon known as event magnification bias. Studies in collective memory show how emotionally charged symbols expand in cultural importance, overshadowing quieter realities. The guillotine wasn't just a tool, it became a mirror for revolutionary fear, anger, and power. Imagine standing in that square now, not during an execution, but on an ordinary day, the scaffold empty, the blade still. Most people going about their lives, bakers, farmers, shopkeepers, but the guillotine looms in the corner of the square, its silent presence enough to shape behavior without moving at all. There's another layer, fear conditioning on a societal level. Just as individuals associate fear with certain objects or places, entire cultures do the same. In studies on trauma memory, psychologists show how single symbols like a siren or a uniform can trigger emotional responses long after the actual threat is gone. For post-revolutionary France, the guillotine became that silent trigger. Now reflect inward. How many symbols in your own mind carry weight far beyond their original size? A single word that triggers old anger, a certain date, a place. Psychologists call this symbolic anchoring. When small objects or moments become disproportionately tied to larger emotions, the paradox deepens. The guillotine was originally designed as a more humane method of execution. Dr. Joseph Egnes, guillotine, its namesake, advocated for it as a more equal form of justice. Fifth, efficient, the same for rich and poor alike. In a strange twist, what became a symbol of terror was meant as a tool of fairness. Imagine now walking up to the scaffold, touching the smooth wood, feeling not just the weight of history, but the complexity of intention versus outcome. This mirrors a cognitive loop called moral paradox processing. Psychologists studying decision-making find that people struggle to hold both positive and negative outcomes in mind at once, often simplifying complex realities into a single dominant emotion. Think now about your own decisions, things you once believed were entirely right or entirely wrong. How many of them contained both success and regret, freedom and cost? Like the guillotine, both sides of the blade. Even now, knowing the quieter truths behind its use, Part of you likely still sees the guillotine as a machine that never stopped falling. That's the recursive symbol effect. Once a symbol is repeated, often enough, its original context fades, replaced by cultural momentum. There's another layer: collective myth, correction, fatigue. In studies on misinformation, researchers find that people tire of hearing corrections to widely held myths. Once a story is cemented, like the endless guillotine, it resists being rewritten, even by truth. Imagine one final moment, standing alone in that square at night. The scaffold dark, the blade still. You realize that its real weight was never in how often it fell, but in how often people imagined it falling. So tonight, as you drift deeper into quieter squares and silent scaffolds in your own mind, ask yourself if even history's sharpest symbols were shaped more by imagination than reality. How many of your own quiet fears and rules have already rusted quietly in the corner, waiting only for you to realize they no longer hold the weight you thought they did? You stand on a windswept moor under a sky the color of iron. Grass bends low in the cold wind, and somewhere beneath your feet, the earth hides footprints long erased. Around you, no banners fly, no voices echo, yet in your mind you see it. A Roman legion marching north, shields raised, faces set. The 9th Legion, 10,000 soldiers, lost without a trace. But as the wind curls around empty stones, a quieter thought settles into place. What if the 9th was never truly missing? What if the real story was simpler than the legend that replaced it? The disappearance of the 9th Legion, also known as Legio IX Hispana, is one of the enduring mysteries of Roman history. Last officially recorded in Roman records around 120 CE, the 9th was once stationed in Britain. Popular accounts suggest it marched into the wilds of Caledonia, modern Scotland, only to vanish forever. Books, films, and theories followed. Ambushes by northern tribes, secret desertion, cover dash-ups, but historians working from inscriptions and auxiliary records suggest a quieter fate. Evidence shows that detachments of the 9th may have been redeployed to the Rhine frontier, or even the Middle East. Its disappearance from British records likely reflected administrative reshuffling rather than disaster. Yet the myth of its sudden loss survives because absence is more powerful than bureaucracy. This ties into a psychological phenomenon called narrative incompletion bias. Studies show that when a story lacks a final chapter, the mind invents one more dramatic than reality. The 9th's quiet fade from paperwork couldn't compete with the image of a legion, swallowed by mist and forest. Imagine now standing alongside those soldiers, not in battle, but in camp, cooking fires, quiet drills, ordinary lives. The paradox deepens. The more ordinary the reality, the more extraordinary the legend grows to fill its place. There's another layer, the vanishing point illusion. Cognitive scientists studying memory find that we exaggerate the scale of things lost. Whether it's a missing person or a lost city, the mind inflates the absence until it feels larger than what actually existed. Now reflect inward. How many quiet things have you lost in your own life? Habits, relationships, memories, turning them into bigger ghosts than they were in reality. Psychologists call this loss magnification. The myth of the 9th Legion became especially popular in modern Britain as a cultural mirror, a story of Roman strength undone by native resilience. Films like The Eagle of the 9th carried the legend further. But real Roman records, including brick stamps and auxiliary deployment notes, show traces of Ninth Legion soldiers serving elsewhere after their supposed disappearance. Imagine again standing on that moor, but instead of silence, you hear the sound of marching, not vanishing, but simply moving on. The soldiers didn't disappear. They simply left that chapter behind. The trap is recursive. The more often an absence is repeated in cultural memory, the more solid it feels. This mirrors the illusory pattern effect. The mind spots patterns and connections where there may only be silence. Think now about your own mental legions, parts of yourself you believe are lost, skills you think you've forgotten, strength you assume has faded. Are those things really gone? Or have they simply shifted to another part of your life's landscape, quiet but still present? Even now, knowing the quieter history, part of you still sees the Ninth Legion vanishing into the mist. That's the recursive echo effect, myths looping so deeply they become self-sustaining. There's also collective anchoring. In group memory, once a story like the Ninth's disappearance anchors itself, it shapes all future interpretations of related events. Every lost patrol, every abandoned fort, becomes linked back to the legend. Imagine one final time standing beneath that cold sky. The moor stretches wide. No banners, no voices, and yet, perhaps they're still marching just beyond sight. So tonight, as you drift deeper into your own quiet frontiers, walking paths both visible and vanished, ask yourself if even the greatest legions in history may have simply walked on instead of vanishing. How many of your own quiet strengths are waiting just beyond the edge of memory, not lost, but waiting quietly for you to notice they never truly left at all? You stand in a clearing at the edge of a vast forest, morning light breaking through trees in pale golden beams. Ahead, a long wooden table stretches across the field, laden with roasted meats, baskets of corn, loaves of bread. Around it, too, groups stand together, English settlers and indigenous people, hands extended in peace, faces lit by quiet gratitude, the first Thanksgiving. But as smoke rises from distant fires and the wind curls between the trees, a quieter thought stirs. What if the story you know isn't quite the truth? What if it was never about one meal or even about thanks? The image of the first Thanksgiving, celebrated each November in the United States, comes from a simplified version of events that took place in 1621 between the Pilgrims of Plymouth Colony and the Wampanoag people. For centuries, school books and paintings have shown this as a single peaceful feast marking the beginning of friendship and gratitude. But historians reveal a far more layered and paradoxical truth. Records from the time, including accounts from Edward Winslow and William Bradford, mention a harvest celebration lasting several days. There was food, yes. There was likely some form of alliance acknowledgement, but there is no evidence that it was seen as a Thanksgiving in the modern sense. More importantly, the event occurred against a backdrop of complex, often violent colonial dynamics. This ties into a psychological phenomenon known as origin myth construction. Societies create simplified founding stories to offer moral clarity and unity. Psychologists studying cultural memory find that these stories prioritize emotional resonance over historical accuracy. Imagine now standing quietly at the edge of that feast, not as a participant, but as an observer, watching not just the sharing of food, but the silences between conversations, the mistrust beneath the surface. Because for the Wampanoag, the alliance was strategic, not simply celebratory. Disease and war had already decimated indigenous populations before the Pilgrims arrived. There's another layer, moral simplification. In cognitive science, researchers show that when faced with morally complex situations, the human brain often defaults to black and white thinking. The first Thanksgiving is remembered as pure unity, omitting the realities of land dispossession, broken treaties, and cultural erasure that followed. Now reflect inward. How many of your own origin stories about yourself, your family, your beliefs have been smoothed over to hide the harder details? Psychologists call this identity preservation bias, filtering memories to keep your self-image coherent. The paradox deepens. Thanksgiving, as a national holiday, wasn't officially established until 1863 by President Abraham Lincoln during the Civil War. It wasn't a colonial tradition carried forward, but a unifying gesture invented in a time of national fracture. Imagine now walking among the tables again, this time noticing what isn't there. Written treaties, maps, weapons set quietly aside. The meal becomes not just about food, but about negotiation, survival, unspoken agreements. This mirrors another cognitive loop called narrative compression. When retelling complex histories, societies naturally collapse them into single, easy-to-grasp images. The long history of indigenous European relations in North America is compressed into one meal. Think again about your own compressed narratives. Stories you tell yourself in a sentence that actually hold years of complexity beneath them. Even now, knowing the quieter history, part of you may still picture the table, the meal, the handshake. That's the recursive myth effect. Again, simplified stories, looping so deeply they feel unshakably true. There's also collective silence. Psychologists studying group memory find that certain truths become culturally unspoken, not erased, but deliberately left in the background to preserve harmony. The harder truths of the first Thanksgiving disease, colonization, survival at a cost exist in that quiet space. Imagine one final moment, standing in that clearing as the meal ends. People leave the table, the forest closes in again. What remains is not a single story, but a layered echo of many truths at once. So tonight, as you drift deeper into your own quiet gatherings of memory and belief, ask yourself if even history's most peaceful meals were shaped as much by silence as by celebration. How many of your own founding stories carry both light and shadow, waiting quietly for you to sit at the table again and see what was always there beyond the feast? You stand at the edge of a wide, slow-moving river. Mist hangs low over the water, and ahead, a wooden settlement rises its rough palisades. Watchtowers, fires burning quietly in the early morning light. Between the forest and the town stands a single figure, a young woman, face painted, eyes steady. You know her name, Pocahontas. But as the sun rises behind her, lighting the river gold, a quieter thought flickers beneath the surface. How much of her story is real, and how much is myth? The legend of Pocahontas has been passed down in books, paintings, films. A Native American girl who saved English settler John Smith, bridged two worlds, and died young. But historians looking closely at early records reveal a more layered and often darker truth. Pocahontas was born Matoka, daughter of Powhatan, leader of a powerful confederation in what is now Virginia. The most famous part of her story, that she threw herself over John Smith to save his life, was not recorded until years later. In Smith's own writings, historians question its accuracy. It may have been invented or exaggerated, shaped by Smith's desire to appear heroic and significant in English eyes. This ties into a psychological pattern called hero narrative bias. Cognitive scientists show how people instinctively shape complex stories into cleaner arcs, focusing on saviors and symbols rather than subtle relationships. Pocahontas becomes not just a person, but a character meant to ease the moral tension of colonization. Imagine now standing beside her, not during a dramatic rescue, but during a quiet moment, carrying water, speaking with family. Most of her life before contact with the English was lived in a world very different from the one later imagined by European writers. There's another layer: cultural erasure through simplification. Psychologists studying memory in multicultural societies show how dominant narratives often erase or smooth over less comfortable truths. In Pocahontas's case, her abduction in 1613 by English colonists, her forced conversion to Christianity, and her marriage to settler John Rolfe are often downplayed or omitted, not reflect inward. How many of your own personal history's family stories, childhood memories have been edited down into simpler, easier to tell versions? Psychologists call this narrative editing. We compress, clean, and sometimes quietly forget. The paradox deepens. Pocahontas traveled to England in 1616, presented as a symbol of the civilizing power of colonization. Portraits show her in English dress, her Powhatan identity muted beneath layers of fabric and expectation. Yet, within months, she died likely of illness far from her homeland. Imagine now standing, not by the river, but in a cold English city. Pocahontas's face hidden beneath lace and cloth, her voice quieted by unfamiliar language. This mirrors the cognitive concept of identity. Masking. People often suppress parts of themselves in unfamiliar or hostile environments, reshaping outward appearances while holding inner truths in silence. Think again about your own identity masks, the parts of yourself you've reshaped to fit into. New roles, new groups, new spaces. Psychologists describe this as adaptive persona, shaping often necessary, but always layered with complexity. Even now, knowing the fuller history, part of you may still see Pocahontas as the smiling figure from paintings and films. That's the recursive myth loop. Again, simpler versions persisting because they feel emotionally easier. There's also the concept of collective memory anchoring. Once a figure like Pocahontas becomes embedded in a national story, her image is difficult to shift. School lessons, holidays, public monuments all reinforce the softened version of her life. Imagine one final moment, standing by the river again, long after the settlements have faded. The water moves on, the land quiet again, and in that silence, the real story remains, not erased, but waiting beyond the surface. So tonight, as you drift deeper into your own quiet rivers of memory and belief, ask yourself if even history's most famous bridges between two worlds were built more from myth than truth. How many parts of yourself have been simplified into quieter stories, waiting quietly beneath the surface for you to remember them as they really were? You stand on a vast plain under a sky so wide it seems to bend downward. The grass waves in endless waves of green and gold, and somewhere on the horizon, dust rises. Hoofbeats rumble like thunder. The Mongol horde, you've heard the numbers. Armies so large they swallowed entire kingdoms, millions of riders moving as one. But as the wind brushes past your face, a quieter question settles in like evening mist. What if the horde was never quite that large? What if the true power wasn't in their size, but in the illusion of it? The image of the Mongol Empire under Genghis Khan and his descendants conjures visions of limitless cavalry forces sweeping across Eurasia. Popular accounts claim the Mongol army numbered as many as 1 million soldiers at its peak. Yet historians, reviewing logistics, records, and archaeology, paint a more measured picture. Most agree the Mongol field armies during major campaigns rarely exceeded 100,000 to 150,000 troops at once. This ties into a psychological pattern called scale amplification bias. Studies in cognitive science show that the human mind instinctively magnifies the scale of perceived threats. A vast, faceless horde feels larger than it actually is, because fear inflates numbers in memory and retelling. Imagine now standing among those riders, not as an enemy, but as an observer. What you see isn't endless soldiers, but carefully arranged columns, smoke signals, messenger relays. Psychological manipulation was a core part of Mongol strategy. They often used decoys, multiple campfires, and false reports to make their armies appear larger than they were. There's another layer, the theater of war effect. Historians note that Mongol generals, including Genghis Khan, deliberately crafted spectacles, leaving deliberate gaps in formations, circling attacks to give the illusion of unending forces. Modern psychology mirrors this in the study of perception control, shaping an observer's interpretation through controlled information. Now reflect inward. How many challenges in your own life have felt impossibly large until you looked closer? Psychologists call this threat magnification bias. Problems imagined in the mind often seem larger than their true dimensions. The paradox deepens when considering logistics. Feeding and moving a truly million-strong army would have been nearly impossible in 13th century Eurasia. Mongol records show disciplined, tightly organized units, tens, 100s, 1000s. Real strength came not from size, but from speed, adaptability, and unified tactics. Imagine again watching that horizon. The dust cloud growing not from countless thousands, but from a few hundred moving precisely. It's not just about numbers, it's about rhythm. This mirrors the psychological principle called effective scale illusion. Experiments show that people often perceive smaller, more coordinated groups as more powerful than larger, disorganized ones. Think now about your own patterns, habits, relationships, fears that feel too vast to control. Are they truly that large? Or are they smaller loops repeating so smoothly they only seem endless? Even now, knowing the quieter historical truth, part of you may still picture an endless sea of riders stretching to the horizon. That's the recursive magnitude effect. Once a scale is imagined, shrinking it back down becomes difficult. There's also collective memory compression. In studying historical memory, psychologists find that later generations often remember only the biggest features of past events, ignoring subtler details. The largest army is easier to recall than the most disciplined small force. Imagine one final moment, standing alone on that plain after the riders have passed. The grass moves again, the dust settles. What seemed like a storm was in fact a finely tuned machine. So tonight, as you drift deeper into your own quiet planes of thought, watching distant clouds that might be armies or only shadows, ask yourself, if even history's largest hordes were shaped more by coordination than by raw size, how many of your own towering challenges are already smaller than you believed, waiting quietly for you to look closer, count more carefully, and see that the real power isn't in their size, but in how smoothly they moved through your mind. You stand in the middle of a quiet street, the air unusually sweet and heavy, Buildings rise on either side, brick walls streaked dark as if stained by old rain. But under your feet, the ground feels strange sticky, almost reluctant to let you move. And then you remember the Great Molasses Flood, a wall of syrup as tall as a building. An event so bizarre it sounds like fiction. But as the sunlight glints off the pavement, a quieter thought drifts in like the smell of burnt sugar. What if the strangest stories we remember are the ones we half forgot first? The Great Molasses Flood happened in Boston, Massachusetts. On January 15th, 1919, a storage tank holding over 2 million gallons of molasses burst, releasing a wave 25 feet high and moving at 35 miles per hour through the city's north end. It killed 21 people, injured 150, and destroyed buildings, vehicles, and railways. Yet for decades afterward, the story faded from public memory. It was largely treated as a local curiosity mentioned in passing, but rarely given the historical weight of more conventional disasters like fires or earthquakes. Psychologists studying collective memory call this selective retention bias. Events that don't fit expected patterns like a flood made of molasses are harder for societies to integrate into historical narratives. Imagine now standing on that same street in 1919. The tank creaks, then explodes not with fire, but with a slow-moving, unstoppable tide of sweetness and death. Witness accounts describe the air as choking, sticky, impossible to escape, horses trapped and drowned, buildings lifted from their foundations. Yet because it doesn't match our idea of how disasters look, it loops in memory differently, half real, half absurd. There's another layer, the surrealism effect. Cognitive scientists find that when real events seem stranger than fiction, the mind tends to treat them like stories rather than facts. The Great Molasses Flood feels like myth, because it bends the boundaries of what we expect from reality. Now reflect inward. How many surreal moments in your own life have you half forgotten, things that felt too strange to fully process? Psychologists describe this as memory flattening. Emotional or unusual events may be recorded in the mind, but details get blurred. Over time, as the brain struggles to fit them into known categories, the paradox deepens with the legal aftermath. The company that owned the molasses tank, U.S. Industrial Alcohol, faced lawsuits for years. Structural flaws and poor maintenance were ultimately blamed, not some unavoidable accident. Yet the story was buried beneath layers of ordinary business and bureaucracy. Imagine again walking those streets decades later. No sign of the flood remains, except local residents claimed. On hot summer days, when the scent of molasses would rise again from the bricks and soil. This ties into another psychological pattern called environmental memory anchoring. Studies show that physical spaces retain associations long after the events tied to them have passed. A smell, a sound, a particular angle of light can trigger a memory loop even when the conscious mind has moved on. Think now about your own internal spaces, objects, habits that carry echoes of past events even when the story itself has faded. Quiet reminders woven into the background of daily life. Even now, knowing all the details, part of you may still find the Great Molasses Flood hard to fully believe. That's the recursive reality distortion effect, when facts loop back on themselves until they feel like fiction again. There's also what psychologists call narrative compression fatigue. In collective memory, unusual disasters often get reduced to a single sentence, the molasses flood. The vivid complexity of the event vanishes into a short manageable phrase. Imagine one final moment, standing on that same street today, tasting sugar in the air that might not even be there. The past moving quietly beneath your feet like syrup beneath cobblestones. So tonight, as you drift deeper into your own quiet floods of memory, walking streets where strange things once happened and faded into silence, ask yourself if even history's sweetest disasters were shaped more by forgetting than by remembering. How many of your own surreal moments are still flowing quietly beneath the surface, half remembered, half real, waiting quietly for you to notice them again? You stand in a quiet classroom, wooden desks lined in neat rows, chalk dust hanging in the air, windows open to the sound of wind. At the front of the room stands a figure hair wild, coat slightly too large, Albert Einstein. You know the story. Already, the boy who failed math in school, dismissed as slow or lazy, only to become one of the greatest minds in history. But as the sunlight slants across the blackboard, a quieter thought emerges like an unsolved equation. What if that story isn't true at all? The image of Einstein as a misunderstood failure is repeated endlessly in books, speeches, and casual conversation. Yet historians and biographers agree Einstein was actually a strong student, especially in mathematics and physics. School records show he excelled in subjects he cared about. The myth likely originated from a mistranslation or misinterpretation of his school grades when viewed through different grading systems. This ties into a psychological phenomenon called redemptive arc bias. In memory studies, people favor stories where early failure turns into later triumph. It creates a satisfying narrative loop. A simple story, genius hidden beneath struggle. Imagine now standing beside the young Einstein, not failing, but quietly absorbed in thought, sketching formulas on scraps of paper, lost in a world beyond the classroom's structure. His real difficulty wasn't with learning, it was with authority. Einstein clashed with rigid educational systems that discouraged questioning. There's another layer, the underdog effect. Cognitive scientists studying motivation show how society loves to uplift figures perceived as underdogs. By framing Einstein as a failure who overcame adversity, his story becomes more relatably if it erases the quieter, more complex reality. Now reflect inward. How many of your own stories begin with a self-imposed myth? I was never good at this, or I always struggled with that. Psychologists call this self-limiting narrative. Often, these beliefs stem from a single early moment. Magnified over time, the paradox deepens with the nature of Einstein's own work. His theories of relativity challenged conventional ideas about time, space, and causality. Yet the man remembered for breaking intellectual boundaries is often falsely pictured as having been trapped by them as a child. Imagine again that classroom, now empty. Equations still faint on the board. The myth is still there to whispered. In every corner, this mirrors another cognitive loop called myth, persistence through simplification. Once a figure like Einstein becomes symbolic, their biography is edited down to fit cultural needs rather than historical fact. Think now about your own quiet myths, skills or traits you once labeled as permanent weaknesses. How many of those are based on a single misunderstood moment, a bad grade, a forgotten lesson, a quiet assumption made long ago? Even now, knowing the truth, part of you may still picture Einstein as a boy standing at the back of the class, lost and failing. That's the recursive underdog loop. Myths that persist even when disproven because they fulfill an emotional need. there's also collective identity reinforcement. Societies teach these stories to inspire perseverance in children and adults alike, even if it means bending historical accuracy. Imagine one final moment, standing outside the school as the bell rings, watching students file out. Among them, one boy carrying a notebook full of quiet brilliance, misunderstood not because he failed, but because he refused to fit the mold. So tonight, as you drift deeper into your own silent classrooms of memory and belief, ask yourself, if even history's greatest minds were reshaped by myth to make them seem like failures first, how many of your own hidden strengths have been waiting quietly behind stories you no longer need to believe, ready to solve the next equation, not because you've overcome weakness, but because you were already capable all along. You stand in a candlelit room, heavy with incense and whispers. Shadows flicker along the walls. At the center sits a man with piercing eyes and a beard that seems to move like a river of black flame. Grigory Rasputin. You know the story already. The mad monk, impossible to kill, healer and manipulator at the heart of a crumbling empire. But as the flame flickers, a quieter thought moves beneath the surface. What if most of what you know was crafted not by history, but by rumor? Rasputin's image has been shaped as much by myth as by fact. Born in a Siberian village in 1869, he rose from obscurity to become a close advisor to Tsar Nicholas II and his wife, Alexandria. His reputation as a healer came from his apparent ability to ease the suffering of the royal couple's hemophiliac son. But beyond that, the lines blur. The most famous part of Rasputin's legend is his death. That it took poison, bullets, beatings, and finally drowning to end his life. Yet historians reviewing police reports and autopsy records from 1916 reveal a quieter truth. Rasputin was likely killed by a small group of nobles intent on saving the monarchy's reputation. He was shot at close range, not subjected to a prolonged supernatural struggle. The drowning detail, almost certainly added later. This ties into a psychological phenomenon called legendary exaggeration bias. When a figure already carries a mystique, every detail around them becomes magnified through repetition and cultural storytelling. Imagine now standing not at Rasputin's side in the grand palaces of St. Petersburg, but in a small apartment, watching him quietly drink tea. The paradox deepens. Rasputin was both powerful and peripheral, held close by the Romanovs, but mistrusted by nearly everyone else. There's another layer, the villainization effect. Cognitive psychologists studying group dynamics show that communities under stress often create scapegoats. Rasputin, with his wild appearance and unpredictable behavior, became the perfect vessel for all of Russia's fears during a time of social collapse. Now reflect inward. How many people in your own life have taken on larger-than-life roles, heroes or villains, through nothing more than repeated stories? Psychologists call this role inflation, allowing a single impression to grow beyond scale. Rasputin's supernatural abilities likely stemmed from charisma, psychology, and timing rather than magic. He understood how to create awe, using silence as much as speech, unpredictability as a form of control. This mirrors a concept called behavioral pattern disruption. Studies show that individuals who break expected social patterns, pausing before speaking, standing too close, refusing normal cues, gain outsized influence in group settings. Imagine again standing in a quiet room with Rasputin. No magic, no violence. Only the weight of his gaze and the quiet uncertainty he cultivated so expertly. Even now, knowing the quieter historical record, part of you may still see him as the unstoppable figure from legend. That's the recursive villain myth. Once a story of danger is embedded in cultural memory, it loops endlessly, outliving its source. There's also historical echo simplification. Rasputin's story has been folded into films, novels, and music, compressing a complex life into a single, dark figure at the center of Russia's fall. Think now about your own internal legends. The parts of yourself you've turned into heroes or villains moments in your own past that now loom larger than life. The paradox becomes clear. Rasputin was both less and more than legend. Less invincible, more human. Less sorcerer, more skilled. Manipulator in a world desperate for certainty. Imagine one final moment, standing by the frozen river where his body was finally found, ice cracking quietly beneath the stars. No supernatural struggle, only the quiet closing of a story that had already begun looping into myth before it ended. So tonight, as you drift deeper into your own quiet palaces of thought, walking halls, where legends and truths mix like candle smoke, ask yourself if even history's darkest sorcerers were shaped more by fear and repetition than by fact. How many of your own shadows are waiting quietly behind your thoughts, less dangerous than they seemed, yet still powerful simply because you've chosen to believe them so many times before? You stand in a vast, silent landscape. Above you, a sky so black it feels infinite, dotted with cold stars. Beneath your feet, grey dust shifts with each steps, so fine it leaves sharp-edged prints that seem to last forever. The American flag stands nearby, its fabric still. You know this image. July 20th, 1969. Apollo 11. Humanity's first step onto the moon. But as your breath slows in the vacuum of thought, a quieter question rises. What if some part of your mind still wonders? If it ever happened at all? The Apollo moon landing is among the most documented events in human history. Photographs, live video, radio transmissions, rock samples. Yet despite overwhelming evidence, a persistent percentage of people worldwide believe it was fake. In a studio staged by the US government during the Cold War, this belief reflects more than skepticism. It reveals something deeper about how the human mind processes truth. Psychologists call this phenomenon proportionality, skepticism, cognitive. Studies show that when faced with an event so large it feels almost mythic, the mind resists believing it fully. A man walking on the moon feels more like legend than news, and legends invite doubt. Imagine now standing in a room where two screens play at once, one showing the moon landing footage, the other showing a film set with cameras, lights, and actors. Your eyes shift between them, unsure which feels more real. This ties into another layer, visual trust bias. Humans evolved to trust what they see in person, not through mediated images. The farther removed an event is through television, through photos, the easier it becomes to question. There's also the familiarity loop. The moon landing footage has been repeated so often it has become background noise. Psychologists studying memory saturation find that overexposure to an image can paradoxically weaken its impact, making it feel staged rather than spontaneous. Now reflect inward. How many moments in your own life feel less real because they've been revisited too many times in thought? A memory replayed so often it becomes a story rather than a fact. Psychologists call this autobiographical flattening. The paradox deepens with the details that conspiracy theories highlight. Shadows at odd angles, the flag appearing to ripple, missing original tapes, Each small inconsistency becomes a hook for doubt, yet many of these details have straightforward explanations: physics, transmission, loss, human error. Imagine now standing on the moon's surface again, but this time with no cameras, no Earth audience, just dust and silence. That's the real root of the loop, an event both too large and too quiet to fully fit into ordinary human experience. Even now, knowing the evidence, part of you may still feel the pulse of that doubt. That's the recursive skepticism effect. Once a possibility is introduced, what if it didn't happen? The question never fully closes. There's also collective myth duality. Psychologists studying cultural memory find that societies often hold contradictory beliefs about major events, believing both in the official story and in its shadow at once. The moon landing becomes both a triumph and a mystery. Think now about your own quiet triumphs, things you achieved but later questioned, asking if they really mattered, if they really happened the way you remember. The moon landing's doubters also reflect something called agency displacement. People uncomfortable with large-scale achievements often attribute them to hidden agent secret cabals, staged operations, rather than accepting human capability on its own. Imagine one final moment, standing at the edge of the sea of tranquility, looking back at Earth, a pale blue dot in the darkness. Whether you believe fully or not, the sight still carries weight. So tonight, as you drift deeper into your own quiet skies, walking landscapes both familiar and impossible, ask yourself if even history's most documented step forward can still feel like a question rather than an answer. How many of your own quiet victories are waiting to be believed again? Not because you lack proof, but because some part of your mind still wonders if they were ever real. You stand in a city that feels as if it is holding its breath. Wooden buildings stretch as far as the eye can see, their rooftops sharp against a night sky streaked with stars. Somewhere in the distance, a single barn creaks quietly in the wind, and then a spark, a flame that leaps too high, too fast. The Great Chicago Fire. But as the first ember drifts upward into the dark, a quieter thought settles beside it. Was it really a cow that started it all? Or was that just the story history chose to tell? The legend is famous. On October 8, 1871, Mrs. O'Leary's cow kicked over a lantern in a barn on DeKoven Street, sparking a fire that destroyed over 3 square miles of Chicago, killing 300 people and leaving 100,000 homeless. But historians examining contemporary reports and records find something more complicated. The cow story first appeared in a newspaper article written by Michael Ahern of the Chicago Republican. Years later, Ahern admitted to fabricating the detail to give the story a memorable hook. This ties into a psychological phenomenon called narrative focalization. Human cognition prefers events with clear causes tied to specific individuals or objects. A cow is easier to remember than the broader truth. A city built almost entirely from dry wooden structures, enduring weeks of drought, poorly prepared for fire. Imagine now standing in that barn as the first flames flicker, not from a cow, but perhaps from a dropped pipe, a spark from machinery, or even arson. No one really knows. The true cause was lost in the chaos. There's another layer. The scapegoat effect. Psychologists studying group memory show how communities under trauma instinctively look for a single source of blame, especially one that feels manageable. Mrs. O'Leary, an Irish immigrant, became an easy target in a city rife with anti-immigrant sentiment at the time. Reflect inward. How many quiet disasters in your own life have been pinned to a single cause, blamed on one mistake? One moment when in truth they were the result of many factors building quietly over time. Psychologists call this simplified causality bias. The paradox deepens. The fire spread not because of one spark, but because of how Chicago was built. Wooden sidewalks, wooden roofs, even wooden gutters. It was a city waiting to burn. Yet rather than remembering systemic vulnerability, the mind prefers a single story. The cow, the lantern, the flame. Imagine again walking through the aftermath. Streets turned to ash, structures crumbling into silence. The city rebuilt, but the cow remained in the story not as fact, but as symbol. This mirrors what cognitive scientists call myth, persistence through utility. Even knowingly false details can survive in cultural memory if they serve a functional purpose, like making history easier to teach, or offering a moral lesson about carelessness. Think now about your own internal myths, personal stories where you tell yourself, that was the moment everything changed, even if, deep down, you know it was a slow build-up. Even now, knowing the quieter truth, part of you may still picture that cow tipping over a lantern in a dark barn. That's the recursive story loop. Once a narrative takes hold, it loops back into itself, growing stronger with each retelling. There's also the concept of collective memory anchoring. In public monuments and school lessons, simple causes are often favored over complex explanations to create shared cultural touchstones. Imagine one final moment, standing on DeKoven Street today, now rebuilt, with no barn in sight. A plaque marks the spot. The real cause remains unsolved, but the cow endures. So tonight, as you drift deeper into your own quiet cities of thought, walking streets paved with both truth and story, ask yourself if even history's greatest fires were shaped more by myth than fact. How many of your own quiet turning points carry echoes not of what really happened, but of the single, easy story you chose to tell yourself afterward, when the dust had settled and the need for answers had already grown too loud to ignore? You stand at the edge of a desert city, its walls shimmering beneath a sky painted in gold and dust. Trumpets sound in the distance, and through the gate rides a man unlike any other, Alexander the Great. His armor glows as if lit from within, his eyes sharp and endless as the horizon. You know his name, you know his legend, the man who conquered the known world before the age of 33. But as the sun sinks low, casting long shadows across stone and sand, a quieter thought rises. Did Alexander truly believe he could never die? And what does it mean when belief becomes its own kind of immortality? The image of Alexander the Great as a man chasing immortality is deeply embedded in both historical texts and popular imagination. Ancient sources describe his visit to the Oracle of Siwa in Egypt, where he was allegedly declared the son of Zeus. His conquests stretched from Greece to India, fueled not just by military genius, but by a growing sense of divine destiny. Yet historians reviewing contemporary accounts like those of Arrian and Plutarch find a subtler truth. While Alexander embraced the image of a god-king, much of his immortality was political theatre. Coins minted in his likeness, statues raised across cities, proclamations linking him to mythic heroes. These were tools of unification and control as much as expressions of belief. This ties into a psychological concept called symbolic immortality. Studies in existential psychology show that humans seek to extend themselves beyond death, not just through children or creations, but through myth and memory. Alexander's pursuit wasn't just about never dying, it was about never being forgotten. Imagine now standing beside him not in battle, but during a quiet moment in a tent under the stars. Maps spread before him. Wine leapt untouched. His eyes fixed on something beyond the horizon. The paradox deepens. Even as he chased eternity, Alexander's body remained mortal. Fever and wounds marked his final days in Babylon, where he died. At 32, under mysterious circumstances, there's another layer, legacy distortion effect. Psychologists studying historical figures find that over time, the real complexities of a life are compressed into single defining traits. Alexander the Conqueror, Alexander the Immortal. But the man was also plagued by paranoia, grief, and loss. Now, reflect inward. How many of your own goals are shaped not just by desire to succeed, but by a quiet need to leave a mark, something remembered? Psychologists call this legacy motivation. It's a form of quiet immortality written not in stone, but in the memory of others. The paradox stretches further when you consider Alexander's own empire. Within a few decades of his death, it fractured into competing kingdoms. His name endured, but his world did not. Immortality, it turns out, is often about the echo, not the structure. Imagine again walking through one of those cities, Xandria perhaps, founded by him, but now filled with lives that have moved on, buildings that no longer remember his footsteps. Even now, knowing all this, part of you likely still feels the pulse of Alexander's legend. That's the recursive hero effect. Once a figure enters the mythic realm, they loop back into culture, stronger with each telling. There's also collective immortality projection. Societies need enduring symbols, so they elevate certain figures beyond human scale. Alexander became that symbol not because he was truly immortal, but because people needed him to be. Think now about your own quiet symbols, names, or faces from your past that feel larger than life, not because of who they were, but because of what they meant to you. Imagine one final moment, standing in the ruins of Babylon, where Alexander's body was once laid to rest, its exact location lost to history, his physical form gone, his myth still alive. So tonight, as you drift deeper into your own quiet conquests of thought, walking between maps both real and imagined, ask yourself if even history's greatest names endured not by living forever, but by being remembered. How many of your own quiet victories are already immortal in someone else's mind, waiting quietly beyond the horizon, echoing long after the map has faded and the sun has set? You stand in the middle of a dense green forest where sunlight breaks through the canopy in sharp beams of gold and shadow. The trees rise tall and silent around you, and somewhere ahead the faint twang of a bowstring echoes through the air. Robin Hood, you know the story, stealing from the rich, giving to the poor, a hooded figure forever slipping just out of reach. But as the wind stirs the leaves in quiet spirals, a quieter thought rises like a whispered rhyme. Was he ever truly real? The legend of Robin Hood has been told and retold for over 700 years. Ballads, plays, films, each version painting him in slightly different colors. Noble outlaw, fallen knight, common archer. Yet historians, digging into records from medieval England, find no single figure who perfectly matches the myth. Instead, there are fragment-scored documents mentioning Robert Hood, outlaw stories from Yorkshire and Nottinghamshire, local tales that likely grew from real events, layered with fiction. This ties into a psychological concept called archetype formation. Cognitive science shows that when multiple similar stories circulate, the human mind compresses them into a single figure to create a clearer narrative. Robin Hood may not have been one man, but many. Imagine now standing not beside one outlaw, but among dozens, woodsmen, rebels, poachers hiding from harsh medieval laws. Forests like Sherwood offered refuge to those who broke rules, often out of necessity, not romance. The paradox deepens. The legend grew not just from fact, but from social need. In times of high taxation, famine, or injustice, stories of a figure who fought back against power gave people hope. There's another layer, the justice myth effect. Psychologists studying folktales across cultures find that nearly every society has a Robin Hood figure, a person who redistributes wealth, challenges authority, balances the scales. These figures reflect collective longing rather than strict. History now reflects inward. How many personal myths have you created for yourself? Moments where you imagine being the one who changes the rules, stands up for what's right, rewrites the story. Psychologists call this narrative self-projection. The earliest surviving ballads about Robin Hood date back to the 14th century. In these, he's less the polished hero and more a rough outlaw, ambushing clerics, defying sheriffs, living by wit and bow. Later versions softened, Hermading made Marian, Friar Tuck. The code of stealing only from the rich. Imagine again standing in Sherwood Forest, but without bright colors or songs. Mud underfoot, hunger in the air. A quiet, desperate life. The myth cleans the edges of reality. Even now, knowing the quieter truths, part of you likely still sees Robin Hood as a single figure, green-cloaked and laughing in the trees. That's the recursive hero loop, a story so deeply woven into culture. It persists, regardless of fact. There's also collective memory anchoring. Robin Hood's image has been reinforced through monuments, place names, and festivals, making the legend feel real simply through repetition. Think now about your own layered legends, family stories, personal reputations, small myths about yourself that have grown larger than the original moments. The quiet trap becomes clear. Robin Hood is real not because of a single man, but because of the space he fills in human thought. A symbol made from fragments. Imagine one final moment, standing at the edge of the forest as dusk falls. The last arrow shot, the last song sung. No clear figure steps forward, no shadows moving through the trees, carrying the story onward. So, tonight, as you drift deeper into your own quiet forests of memory and belief, ask yourself if even history's clearest heroes were shaped more by need than by fact. How many of your own quiet rebellions are already legend in the minds of others, not because they happened exactly as remembered, but because someone needed them to? You stand on the deck of a ship as night falls over an endless stretch of ocean. The stars disappear one by one, swallowed by low clouds. Compass needles spin. Radios crackle and fall silent. Somewhere beneath the waves, the engines stutter and fail. The Bermuda Triangle. You know the story. A place where ships vanish, planes disappear, and no explanation holds for long. But as the waves rise and fall in quiet rhythm, a quieter thought drifts in like mist. What if the real mystery isn't the triangle itself, but why we keep believing in it? The Bermuda Triangle, marked roughly between Miami, Bermuda, and Puerto Rico, gained global fame in the mid-20th century. Stories of Flight 19, a squadron of US Navy bombers that vanished in 1945, fueled public imagination. Books like The Bermuda Triangle by Charles Berlitz made the myth famous, blending fact with speculation. Rogue waves, magnetic anomalies, even alien interference. Yet researchers reviewing maritime and aviation records find a more ordinary pattern. According to the U.S. Coast Guard and the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration, NOAA, the number of disappearances in the Bermuda Triangle is not significantly higher than any other heavily traveled stretch of ocean. Most incidents have plausible explanations: sudden storms, equipment failure, human error. This ties into a psychological phenomenon called expectation confirmation bias. Cognitive scientists show that once a region is labeled as mysterious, every event within it is viewed through that lens. A ship lost elsewhere is a tragedy. A ship lost in the Bermuda Triangle becomes part of the myth. Imagine now standing at the helm, staring into fog that seems thicker than it should be. Your mind fills the silence with shapes, lights where there are none, shadows moving just out of sight. This mirrors another effect, the ambiguity enhancement loop. Human brains magnify unexplained gaps in information, especially when fear is involved. There's another layer, collective pattern creation. Sociologists studying cultural legends find that once a story like the Bermuda Triangle becomes popular, people unconsciously look for ways to support it, highlighting matching details, while ignoring contradictions. Now reflect inward. How many patterns in your own life have you created, not from facts, but from repeated belief, quiet triangles in your mind where things always seem to go wrong? Psychologists call this cognitive triangulation, focusing attention on particular zones or habits, reinforcing their importance through repeated mental loops. The paradox deepens when considering modern navigation. Today's GPS systems and satellite monitoring show no unusual disruptions in the region. Pilots and captains cross it daily, yet part of you may still feel a pulse of unease, imagining that same stretch of water even now. Knowing the scientific data, part of your mind may still see the Bermuda Triangle as a place where logic falters. That's the recursive mystery effect. Once a question becomes part of cultural memory, it loops, persisting long after the answers are known. There's also myth adaptation theory. Legends like the Bermuda Triangle evolve over time, absorbing new fears, alien abduction theories in the 1970s, quantum anomalies in the 1990s. The story adapts to fit each generation's anxieties. Imagine again standing at the ship's bow, wind rising around you. No lights, no horizon, and yet you keep moving forward. That's the quiet truth beneath the myth. The sea itself is always dangerous, always unknown, triangle or not. Think now about your own unsolved questions, the triangles you carry in. Memory, where certain things never seem to make sense. Relationships, habits, old failures. Are they truly mysteries, or patterns you've unconsciously reinforced? The Bermuda Triangle survives not because of proof, but because of the space it fills in thought, a quiet reminder that even now, there are still places where certainty fades. So tonight, as you drift deeper into your own quiet oceans, walking the decks of memory and belief, ask yourself if even history's clearest mysteries are shaped more by repetition than by evidence. How many of your own quiet questions have already been answered, waiting just beyond the next wave, lost? Not because the truth wasn't there, but because you were looking for a triangle when all you needed was a map. You stand beneath a flickering gas lamp on a rain-slicked street in London's Whitechapel district. The cobblestones glisten darkly under your feet. In the distance, footsteps echo slow, deliberate, then gone. Jack the Ripper. You know the story. The faceless killer who haunted 1888 London, leaving behind 5 victims and an unsolved mystery. But as the mist drifts through the alleyways like a second skin, a quieter thought creeps in alongside the shadows. What if the real story wasn't about who Jack was, but about why we needed him to stay unknown? The legend of Jack the Ripper looms larger than the documented facts. Between August and November of 1888, 5 women, Marianne Nichols, Annie Chapman, Elizabeth Stride, Catherine Edos, and Mary Jane Kelly, were murdered in ways that shocked Victorian society. The killings were brutal, the letters sent to police chilling, but historians, studying the case closely, find that much of what the public remembers was shaped not by police files, but by newspapers and public fear. This ties into a psychological pattern called horror amplification bias. Studies in media psychology show that the more ambiguous a threat is, the larger it becomes in the mind. Jack's true identity was never confirmed, so he grew into an icon. The eternal faceless killer. Imagine, now standing not beside the police investigators, but among the pressmen of the time. Headlines screamed from every corner. The White Fiend, Leather Apron, Saucy Jack. In many cases, facts were exaggerated or invented. Some of the most famous letters attributed to Jack, including the From Hell letter, are now believed by experts to have been hoaxes crafted by journalists. There's another layer: collective fear, consolidation. Psychologists show how societies under stress compress unrelated dangers into a single figure or symbol. Victorian London was a city grappling with poverty, disease, overcrowding, and political unrest. Jack the Ripper became the embodiment of all that unease. Now reflect inward. How many fears in your own life have been shaped not by direct experience, but by stories repeated until they felt personal? Psychologists call this myth-induced anxiety, carrying fear from cultural legends as if they belonged to your own memory. The paradox deepens when considering the real victims. Modern research emphasizes that the women killed were often marginalized sex workers, poor, vulnerable. But in popular memory, Jack became the focus, not his victims. This mirrors what cognitive scientists call perpetrator-centric memory bias, focusing on the source of threat rather than those affected by it. Imagine again walking those streets today. Tourists visit Ripper walking tours. Museums sell souvenirs. The shadow of Jack persists, but the full human weight of his story has faded. Even now, knowing these quieter truths, part of you may still feel the chill of that alleyway, the whisper of unseen footsteps. That's the recursive horror effect. Once a fear enters collective thought, it loops endlessly, growing larger with each retelling. There's also a psychological loop called unresolved narrative attraction. Stories without clear endings, solved mysteries, lost names pull at the mind more powerfully than those with closure. Jack the Ripper survives because no one could write his final chapter. Think now about your own unsolved loops, moments or choices in your past where no clear ending ever came. Questions that still hover at the edges of memory. The real Jack was likely less supernatural, more ordinary, a local criminal, a figure lost in the background noise of a city in crisis. Modern forensic studies suggest possible suspects, but none are definitive. And perhaps that's why the myth lasts, because it fits a need deeper than truth. Imagine one final moment, standing alone in Whitechapel as dawn breaks. The fog lifts, the streets empty. The danger is gone, but the story remains. So tonight, as you drift deeper into your own quiet alleys of memory and belief. Ask yourself if even history's darkest shadows were shaped more by repetition than reality. How many of your own quiet fears are still walking those same empty streets, waiting not because they are unsolved, but because you've grown used to hearing their footsteps? You stand at the edge of a wide city square, surrounded by towering glass buildings, polished steel, and quiet streets. The sky stretches clear and endless above, no smoke, no banners, no war drums. For a moment, it feels complete, finished. Humanity has arrived at its final form. But as your footsteps echo against clean pavement, a quieter thought settles into place like a reflection in mirrored glass. What if the idea that history has ended is itself a myth? The phrase "the end of history" was popularized by political scientist Francis Fukuyama in 1989. He argued that liberal democracy and free market capitalism, emerging victorious from the Cold War, might represent the final form of human government. No more revolutions, no more ideological battles, just gradual refinement. But psychologists and historians examining this idea reveal its quiet paradox. The belief in an end of history is itself a historical pattern. This ties into a psychological phenomenon called presentism bias. Studies in cognitive science show that people often view their current era as the culmination of all that came before, underestimating future change. Ancient Romans, Renaissance thinkers, even Victorians, believed their time was the peak of civilization. Imagine now walking through that city square again, but with cracks slowly appearing in the glass. A protest sign left behind, a window shattered. The illusion of finality breaks down. That's the deeper truth. History never really ends, it only shifts shape. There's another layer: stability, illusion. Psychologists studying personal identity show that people tend to overestimate how stable their values and habits will remain, even though change is constant. Societies mirror this. What feels permanent now may be forgotten in a few decades. Now reflect inward. How many times in your own life have you believed you'd arrived, reached a final version of yourself, only to change again? Psychologists call this self-continuity distortion. We see ourselves as stable narratives, but in reality, we're recursive loops. The paradox deepens. Since Fukuyama's theory, the world has seen countless upheavals, technological revolutions, global conflicts, resurgent ideologies, and yet the myth persists in quieter forms through the belief that progress is inevitable. Unstoppable, smooth dot. Imagine again standing in that square as night falls. The city lights flicker. Some stay on, some go dark. That's how history really moves, not in straight lines, but in echoes. Even now, knowing all this, part of you may still feel the quiet comfort of believing some things never change. That's the recursive stability effect, clinging to loops, because they feel safer than facing constant flux. There's also collective memory compression. Societies package past eras into simple stories. The Roman Empire, the Industrial Revolution. Each was once a living, changing presentant, till it wasn. Single quotes T. Think now about your own compressed narratives. Times in your life you now summarize in a sentence, even though they once stretched endlessly in your mind. The trap becomes clear. Believing history can end is itself a kind of blindness. Psychologists call this temporal horizon limitation, the inability to see beyond the current. Moments frame. Imagine one final moment, standing at the city's edge, where buildings fade into forests, roads dissolve into dirt paths. The map doesn't end. It only becomes quieter. So tonight, as you drift deeper into your own quiet timelines of thought, walking between past and future, ask yourself if even history's clearest conclusions were shaped more by need for certainty than by fact. How many of your own quiet endings are simply new beginnings waiting to unfold? Not because the story has finished, but because you've only just reached the edge of the next page. You've walked through 50 myths tonight, 50 echoes of history's unfinished sentences, from vanished legions to untouchable outlaws, from forgotten floods to footsteps on the moon. Each story began with the same quiet illusion that there was a clear answer, that the past could be wrapped up in one perfect sentence, one image, one name. But as each section unfolded, you may have felt it not resolution, but recursion, a deeper loop opening beneath every fact. This is the real story behind famous historical myths. Not just what happened, but why we remember them the way we do. It isn't just about heroes, villains, or events. It's about the architecture of human thought, our need for simplicity, for closure, for figures like Robin Hood and Jack the Ripper, for triangles in the sea, for the idea that history could ever end. Psychologists call this narrative compression. Historians call it cultural memory, but tonight, for a little while, you've stepped outside those loops. You've walked quieter roads, looked beneath smoother surfaces, and now, as you drift deeper into sleep or thought, there's one final paradox waiting. If you believe you've learned something tonight, that you now see these stories more clearly, that mean the myths have ended for you? Or have you simply created a new, quieter version of them inside your own mind? The truth never fully closes. It only echoes, again and again, until the myth becomes part of you, until you become part of the myth.